Fargo Police Chief. They lead a command staff responsible for oversight of divisions of the department. We'll ask them to talk about how they will engage their command staff to lead in a way that supports their overall strategy while engaging, inspiring, and informing the officers who work in their divisions. Number 6, we'll ask how they have educated themselves on racial and socioeconomic inequities at a local, state, and national level, and how they think these factors have influenced their leadership of a police force. Number 7, asking them to describe their experience in gathering and tracking police department data to maintain an equitable police department in regard to race, homelessness, income, and other demographic factors. We'll ask how the data has been collected and analyzed, and how they've used this data in their department's strategic plan. Number 8, we're asking them to talk about one of the most difficult decisions that they have ever made as a leader in law enforcement and to tell us about those circumstances. Number 9, asking how they've developed work relationships through trust and respect, and we want to ask them to provide specific examples in that regard. On page 18, number 10, we're asking about what responsibilities they've had in leading a strategic budgeting process for a police department and how they've developed and presented their budgets. And then finally, number 11, to what extent have they been involved in establishing, communicating, and following up on performance expectations, and how they've aligned those performance expectations with organizational goals. So those are all of the questions. We'll be asking a total of 11 questions. We have about an hour for this portion of the interview, and an opportunity again for any follow-up questions that you all have of the candidates. On page 19, then you'll see an individual score sheet for our first candidate. And this is the score sheet that, I should say, follows those 11 topic areas, again, using that 1 through 5 rating. Are there any questions on the interview or the scoring criteria for the interview? Okay. So on pages 20 through 41 are the presentation packets and interview packets for candidates 2 and 3. So we are going to skip past those packets and move to page 42. On page 42, we begin the portion of the day where we'll have the candidates engaged in mock news conferences. So the scenario for the mock news conference is based on an officer-involved shooting, and those details can be found on page 42. Members of the media have been invited to participate in this portion of the process. So each of the candidates will be given the same scenario information that you have on page 42 of your packet. The candidates will have 15 minutes with this page of information to prepare for the mock news conference. And then they'll come into the commission chambers and will be at the podium before you, and they'll have a 15-minute window to deliver their statement and answer any questions from participating members of the media during that time. So following all 3 candidates' mock news conferences, we'll ask the members of the participating media to provide feedback on the candidates' statements, as well as their responses to the questions. And as we flip to page 44 through 46, you have full pages there for notes as the candidates are delivering their news conference. And on page 47 through 49, there's a summary score sheet for each of the candidates. So again, we've provided factors for you to consider that are relevant to the mock news conference as you are rating each of the candidates. I won't go through each of those factors, but do you have any questions before we talk about the next portion of the assessment day? Okay, so we're going to flip ahead then to page 50 of the packet. At this point, we'll begin the candidate discussion. So during the candidate discussion, all 3 candidates participate in this activity. They will be given questions to discuss with the other candidates. This activity is also sometimes referred to as a leaderless group. So it's really designed to simulate 3 police chiefs discussing law enforcement topics among themselves. And the candidates are assessed on their responses as well as how they interact with other candidates throughout this exercise. So beginning on page 51, again, I just want to briefly talk through the questions or topics that they will be addressing. So the first topic addresses the stigma of mental health. And as the chief, we're asking how they will handle the challenge creating a culture of support that normalizes officers and civilian staff seeking help for mental health issues. We also want to hear how they monitor individual and overall mental health status of their workforce. Question 2, we want to hear about the role of social media in policing and how and when they believe social media is an effective tool, how and when they believe social media creates challenges for police departments. And then we want to hear about their role in creating a social media strategy or overseeing the use of social media in the police department as an organizational leader. Number 3, and the final question, we are asking them, many in the community want change and progress in law enforcement. Many also want to know how the Fargo Police Department will not lose sight of protect and serve. So what will be the first thing that they implement into the future of policing at the city of Fargo that they feel is going to be a step in the right direction? So beginning on page 54 through 56, again, there are individual score sheets. We've provided some factors for you to use as you're rating the candidates. Number 1 and 2 are really general impressions of the candidate discussion. As we get to 3 to 5, those are specifically tied to the actual questions that the candidates will be responding to. So the remainder of your binder includes sections for each candidate with their application materials so that you can reference those throughout the day as you would like. This candidate discussion is really the last activity of the day with our candidates. So they'll leave the commission room while you complete the scoring. And as a reminder, throughout the day, we're asking that you turn in your score sheets to Jennifer in the back corner here. After each component, so she can be compiling the scores throughout the day. Once the scoring is compiled, we're going to provide those scores to you so that you can reference them as you discuss the overall results of the assessment. And again, the assessment and scoring were developed to help you as a committee really quantify the results and rank the candidates to determine which candidate will be recommended for advancement. Are there any questions on the assessment before we move ahead with a few reminders? Yes.
Just on the leaderless group, are they aware that they're in an experiment?
They are aware that they are in a leaderless group. They've been given a schedule that just has that limited information. So they are aware of that.
Okay, thank you.
Prior to each segment, we'll be doing brief instructions for the candidates as well. So we'll reinforce that for the 3 of them as well during that portion. Yes. Okay, so we will be bringing the candidates into the room very shortly. We're scheduled to start here at 8:15. The mayor will open by welcoming the candidates, and then we'll ask each of you to briefly introduce yourselves before we begin the opening discussion, now that the candidates are actually here in person. Before we bring them into the room, though, I want to remind everyone in the commission chambers today, and we may have people in and out throughout the day, that our candidates and our committee have a very full day, an important day ahead. So, we appreciate that we'll have members of the public here to observe throughout the day, but we just want to remind everyone present in the chambers that our candidates and you all as a committee will need to be fully focused on our assessment. So we ask that everyone silences their cell phones, and if there's a need for conversation, that we're exiting the commission chambers for those conversations. So we just appreciate everyone's cooperation in maintaining a quiet room that's free of distraction for the assessment as we move throughout the day. All right, any questions before we begin? We have a couple of minutes before the candidates will come in. If you haven't had a chance to grab coffee or water, please help yourself. They're in the far back corner, and the candidates should be with us in just about 4 minutes.
Any of you like coffee or water? We're gonna go up here inside. So we have your names and alphabet.
Thank you.
Morning. Morning.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Good. It is a.
Thank you.
Morning. We'll start early since everybody's got coffee and water and ready to go. On behalf of the Fargo Police Chief Selection Committee and the City of Fargo, I want to welcome you to the City of Fargo. We truly feel this community is a gem of the Upper Midwest, the regional leader, and a great place to work and live. We hope you enjoyed your time in Fargo so far. You spent a lot of time with the police force, and now you get to spend time with this committee. We thank you, three candidates, for your interest in this career opportunity. I know that it's a great city to be police chief for. Today, we're anxious to learn more about you as candidates for the Fargo Police Chief position and hear more about your vision for the Fargo City Police. As you know, the selection committee is comprised of city officials, commission members, community members, and members of the Fargo Police Force. Early in the process, you will receive the member biographies. Before we begin today's assessment, however, we will go around the room and have the individual selection committee members briefly introduce themselves. We'll start with Bruce Grubb.
Good morning. My name is Bruce Grubb, and I'm City Administrator for the City of Fargo, and I want to thank you all for being here and welcome.
Good morning, sir.
Officer Jessica White. Nice to see you again.
Good morning.
Nadal Omar, good to see you guys.
Good morning, sir.
Whitney Liedall, welcome.
Good morning.
Jason Boynton, welcome to Fargo.
Thank you. Good morning.
Welcome, Dave Leaker, Fargo Park District Executive Director.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, I'm Jane Pettinger. I serve on the Civil Service Commission for the City of Fargo, and I'm an educator at Minnesota State University, Moorhead.
Good morning.
Mike Sandin, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Rupak Gandhi. Get to serve as the superintendent of schools for Fargo Public Schools.
Good morning.
Good morning and welcome to Fargo. My name is Lenore King. I'm the chairwoman for the Fargo Native American Commission.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning. I'm Michael Redlinger. I'm the Assistant City Administrator, City of Fargo. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Good morning.
Good morning, Tanya Graywind, and I am Assistant Director for a state agency.
Dave Pepcorn, Fargo City Commission.
So now you get to see us in person, and now we get to get into the selection. I'm going to turn over this part of this program to Jill and Jen from Human Resources to begin the assessment. Welcome.
Good morning. So we will begin today's assessment with an opening discussion. We will be asking each of you to respond to 3 questions, and we'll be rotating the order in which you respond so that each of you will have the opportunity to respond first during this first exercise. You'll each have a maximum of 5 minutes to respond to each of the questions. And so you'll see Jen or I raise our hand if we're getting to that 1 minute mark, just as a reminder that we're nearing the 5-minute limit for each of your responses. Are there any questions before we begin?
No, ma'am.
Okay, we will be beginning with Mr. John Franklin. You get to go first. So, John, some communities have implemented citizen or civilian oversight committees. What are your views on engaging citizens in an oversight capacity? And what are the pros and cons of this type of non-sworn oversight?
This is a common occurrence taking place in a lot of cities across America now. And I personally don't have a problem with citizen oversight committees. I think the major issue most police agencies will have with them is exactly how much power they have. I have seen some instances where, recently in Milwaukee, the Citizen Oversight Committee demoted their chief, Alfonso Morales, due to an incident that had happened, I think maybe 1 or 2 years ago. He's been the chief for almost 3 years, and they just recently demoted him. The mayor at that time was happy with the performance of Chief Morales, but apparently one person, the chairman of the Citizen Oversight Committee, had a long-standing issue with Chief Morales. Apparently, some of the officers had stopped one of the Milwaukee Bucks basketball players about 2 years ago in a parking lot, and in Walgreens. He was sitting in his car, but sitting in a handicap spot. It was at night, and I believe the store was about to close. There's nobody in the parking lot, but the officer stopped him, got him out of the car. Apparently, the basketball player got out, ordered the athlete to take his hands out of his pockets, and when he didn't do it, I guess, fast enough, they decided to tase him. This Citizen Oversight Committee chairman requested that Alfonso Morales fire the officer, and apparently Alfonso Morales felt that there was a better solution in firing him. And just recently, about a week and a half ago, Chief Morales was demoted back down to captain. Now he's decided to retire. I believe, first of all, I know that police officers do answer to the public. We serve the public. We're guardians of the communities we serve. And we have a high level of accountability to the public we serve. Like I said, my main concern is just how much power a citizen oversight committee has. How many channels or how many steps does it take for a citizen oversight committee to have the power or have the authority to actually terminate a department member? I think that's a concern probably shared by most police officers.
Thank you. And now, Chief Zabalski. The same question. Some communities have implemented citizen or civilian oversight committees. What are your views on engaging citizens in an oversight capacity? What are the pros and cons of this type of non-sworn oversight?
Sure, thank you. My views in terms of the oversight, I think it's critically important that we do have community engagement in oversight. As Mr. Franklin referenced, in Wisconsin, we have statutory authority for police and fire commissions, and they are a civilian review board. They don't necessarily involve themselves in policy, but they do hear disciplinary hearings and appeals, so much like your civil service commission in a sense, but they do have some oversight ability. In terms of, and I think this is an important thing, and I understand that it's an important thing, especially here in Fargo and even nationally. From a pro perspective, I think the community wants to feel engaged and have trust with their law enforcement professionals. That is critically important. We need to build strong relationships with them, and one way that we foster those relationships is through transparency, objective decision-making. So when we, as chiefs, decide disciplinary issues, those are open to the public. And I think from a pro perspective, there's a roadmap for us here in Fargo, for law enforcement in general, to involve the community in these types of activities. I do strongly believe that the disciplinary decision needs to reside with the chief, and research by a professor out of Omaha University into these issues agrees with that position, that in his research over several years of citizen oversight boards, he's found that citizen oversight boards have been more lenient to the officers than the chief executive, than the chief often is. Because I think we do understand the profession and the do's and don'ts, and are able to discern a ministerial act ignored or a malicious act done versus a well-intentioned act that just went awry, and take appropriate disciplinary action or training and policy to change that behavior, which is the focus of discipline. I think from the con perspective, I would agree that if given too much autonomy without understanding, we will demotivate and demoralize our law enforcement professionals and place the chief in a position where really don't have control of the department. I think, and I do take full responsibility for the discipline and the actions of our department, and so I think that authority has to rest there. And I'm more than happy at any time to sit down with community, either groups, boards, or what have you, and explain how the disciplinary decisions were made and why they were made. I'm a large proponent of educating our community, and a lot of the conflicts that we see in our community are a combination of misunderstanding and misperception of the law in terms of what citizens' rights and obligations are, coupled with, in some cases, misapplication by law enforcement officers. We have to use our legitimate authority appropriately. And that's where those conversations begin, but I think certainly I'm open to having citizens, some type of citizen oversight, input, what have you, and working down that roadmap so that we have greater interconnectivity and continue to build that trust and relationships with our Fargo community.
Thank you. And next, Mr. Stacy Kelly. Stacy, some communities have implemented citizen or civilian oversight committees. What are your views on engaging citizens in an oversight capacity? And what are the pros and cons of this type of non-sworn approach or oversight?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Overall, I am a proponent for civilian oversight, but I will tell you, as a CALEA assessor, and CALEA is the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies. That's a program that agencies choose to join, which has officers from outside the area come in and go through your department top to bottom to make sure you are doing things right, meeting standards. I had the opportunity to do Knoxville Police Department in Tennessee, which has one of the most successful oversight committees. They do it right. All of their members come on. They receive training in police practices. They're actually sent out to schools. And I think that is the key to them being successful, is making sure they know what they're getting into. With that being said, the majority of oversight committees have issues and they don't run smooth. Just all the studies show that there are some issues out there and it needs to be set up appropriately. The pros to them creates transparency and trust when you have citizens seeing everything and can report back. That does help open up the department, transparency and trust. The cons, as I mentioned, kind of alluded to earlier, there's citizens not familiar with our practices and political appointments. Have been some where the appointments were purely political, and that always ends in disaster. It has to be objective selections for people that are placed on these boards. I think a good way to meet in the middle is a hybrid form. In Newport News, we have civilians involved in our use of force committee. This is taken very popular with the officers and with the citizens. And actually talking to some of the officers here, I think they would be open to a use of force committee, because what happens when your use of force is working up through the chain of command, it's according to who is in your chain of command and their training and background as to the way they substantiate or not substantiate. You could have a mid-level commander who hasn't really been out on the street in a while, not familiar with use of force, making judgment on force. When you have this committee with your training representatives, different representatives from the agency, and civilians providing input to the chief, I think it's a broader thing. Same thing could apply to your policy and your strategic management plans, having citizen participation there with citizens that you have put through the Citizen Police Academy, and they understand the agency and know what the practices are so that they can evaluate these things and have a voice in the process. So I think it can still be accomplished, and I know these work. I've seen them work in agencies in the past.
Thank you.
Okay, so the next question is going to be for Dave. As the Fargo Police Chief, what indicators or outcome will you use to measure the success for the police department? How will you build these indicators into a strategic plan and communicate the outcomes to all key stakeholders?
Thank you. In terms of judging success, there's a number of key factors. Obviously, number one is overall public safety and reduction in crime. We have a different crime metrics here in Fargo. There's a lot of burglaries, thefts, that type of crime. You don't have a large violent crime issue, although I think folks living in neighborhoods have different views on how they feel about their neighborhoods. And our number one job is making sure that the public spaces are safe for everyone. In Beloit and in other organizations, we've conducted fear surveys in different neighborhoods and citywide, using partnerships with our local college to get those surveys out to folks to see how they feel about the safety of their neighborhoods, and then follow up and respond from there. So that's one measure, the crime statistics, what the community feels. I think getting out and meeting with your different neighborhood associations, different community groups, business groups, et cetera, such as your downtown business association. I know there's issues there with open intoxicants and some disorderly conduct that occurs at certain points. So every neighborhood in our community has different issues that they view as important, and I think that that's one of our main goals, is to try and address as many of those different neighborhood issues as we can, working collaboratively with those individuals to address them. And it's the feedback from the community that I think is a good measure of whether or not the police department is successful. Another good measurement, I think, is in terms of community cooperation. In some communities, I don't believe here in Fargo, but in some communities, the police have great difficulty getting cooperation when violent crimes or other crimes do occur, because the public does not trust the police. So implementing the 4 pillars of procedural justice, both internally and externally with our community, so that we are seen as legitimate. And when the community views us as legitimate, meaning they find that we are trustworthy and competent, so they believe we are competent in what we're doing and they trust what we're doing, that it is in the best interest of the community, that they find our actions morally just, and as a byproduct of that, they are willing to acquiesce to law enforcement authority. They cooperate with us. We don't have to use force because we have built relationships and they trust us. And so when we ask them to do something, they're more inclined to abide by that. So those are large pieces of, and when we have investigations and we need information, our community responds. In Beloit, we've had excellent response from our community because of these issues. We have gone to great lengths to build those relationships, to make ourselves open and transparent with the community. And they've really stepped up and provided information, not only in investigations, but in other activities that are occurring in the city. So I think that's an important component and an important measurement. So some of it is qualitative and some of it is quantitative. But I don't think we could ever take for granted that we have most cops would say, hey, we have great community support in Fargo, and I wouldn't necessarily argue with that, but our goal is to have great community support in every neighborhood in Fargo and with every different group, and it's a very diverse community, and we have a lot of people living here that aren't even familiar with American law enforcement. You have your new Americans that are integrated into our community, and I think we need to utilize our resources, both in the department and even our new academy, to try and create programs for those new Americans so that they can be acclimated to American policing. And so we've got your general public who's grown up here forever, but may not know the laws, and we've got other influxes of folks who come from very different backgrounds and experiences, and certainly may not trust the police from the beginning. So I think, again, the qualitative, quantitative approach to measuring that is how we measure success. And I think anything or suggestions from the community as well, I think that's a good way to go as well, and see what they think in terms of their satisfaction with the department.
Okay, Stacy, you're up next. So as the Fargo Police Chief, what indicators or outcomes will you use to measure the success for the police department? How will you build these indicators into a strategic plan and communicate the outcomes to the key stakeholders?
So there's a great book out there called Measure What Matters, and in that book they talk about objectives and key results. We in the law enforcement are great with coming up with objectives. Where we sometimes drop the ball is establishing key results which are measurable. It's good to come up with feel-good results, but you really need to be able to measure them for them to be effective. This is where a strategic management plan comes into play. Some of our objectives would be set out as reducing crime, the fear of crime, community engagements, but this is where the steering committee would come into play as defining the objectives or the key results for that. This would be made up of officers, command staff, and some civilians that would help establish these results to see what we want to measure, what's important to the community of Fargo. As the chief, I would guide this discussion, but it needs to come from within and have as much input as possible. Things that we could measure would be, how many community engagements do our officers have? It's real easy to count summonses and arrest, but what is that telling you? We want to talk about things such as community engagements. Are you addressing specific crime in your beat and hold them accountable for their beat? And this would be a living document that could be adjusted as necessary, because as we know and as we've seen this year with COVID, things can change in a heartbeat. So this needs to be living. And that steering committee, not only would they help create it, but we would report back to them monthly and would assign stakeholders to be responsible for each objective, and they would report back, and the steering committee would hold them accountable to make sure we are meeting these objectives, key results, staying on, and they would also provide feedback to us if we need to make adjustments here or there. Other ways that I would get feedback are from elected officials, the community leaders. Some people feel more comfortable talking to them that they already have relationships with. They may not come to the police department. So I'd make sure I'm open to input from all aspects of the community. And citizen surveys. As the chief said, this is a collegiate town. There's a lot of resources here that we could tap into to help us with surveys to gauge the feel of the community and see where we're going. So, thank you.
Thank you, Stacy. Okay, John? As the Fargo Police Chief, what indicators or outcomes will you use to measure the success for the police department? How will you build these indicators into a strategic plan and communicate the outcomes to all key stakeholders?
Good morning, thank you. As the other two chiefs pointed out, I would start out with resident surveys. Find out, what do the residents think are the most pressing problems going on here in Fargo today? What do they think we should be focusing on? What does the community feel are the most pressing issues today? Does the community feel comfortable with reporting crime to the police? Back home, where I'm from in Chicago, a lot of people don't feel safe reporting crime for the simple fact that they feel vulnerable to retaliation from the gang members they can testify against who have committed heinous crimes, violent crimes. We have to make sure these citizens know that if they do come to us with vital information to make arrests that lead to convictions in violent crime, especially in violent crime cases, that we can keep them safe as well. While we're going after the bad guys, we're also keeping the residents safe from retaliation, because that's a very serious reality for a lot of people. We also want to reduce crime, but we need the community's assistance. We have to let the community know we can't do it without them. They have to assist us. We don't exist in a vacuum. It doesn't happen like in an hour TV show. By the end of the show, we've solved that crime. It doesn't work like that. We need the community's help. We need the community to understand that we'll keep their confidence. Whatever they tell us, we will keep confidence, and we will use that information to the best of our ability. Body cams. I know your agency doesn't have them. They need them. And they need them as soon as they can get them. Body cams are essential today, because if you don't have it on camera, it didn't exist. We just recently had a bad shooting back home where, unfortunately, the officers that handled that shooting, that were a part of it, weren't actually outfitted with body cams as of yet. They went from plainclothes officers, which don't wear body cams, to patrol officers, and they didn't quite have them outfitted with cameras yet. Now, this young man fired several shots at the police, for the police fired back. They didn't kill him, but they did wound him. Here's a picture in the paper, the weapon recovered. But unfortunately, some residents of the community beat us to the punch on social media and put it out there. There was no gun. He had his hands up. You know, the same sort of stuff that happened with Michael Brown. And unfortunately, before the police department could get their word out as to what actually occurred, it was already out on social media that we were the bad guys. And everybody needs a camera. Everybody needs to be wearing cameras today. Angry confrontations resulted as a result of that. So I can't tell how much cameras are essential. Reaching out to your immigrant community. As driving around in Fargo, I saw you have a significant immigrant community here. Do we understand the customs of these people that are new arrivals to America? Because there are some things we can do that they might find offensive in their culture. A lot of these people are coming from countries where the police have brutalized many of their populations. So they obviously have a lot of timidity, a lot of fear of the police. So we got to work extra hard with those people to make sure they understand you're not back home, you're here. You have a voice. Everyone is treated with respect, and we will respect you regardless of where you come from. Again, as I concur with the other two chiefs, resident surveys, finding out what the residents feel is necessary. And then going out there, attacking the data, looking at where the crimes are occurring. In some parts of the city, people may not report that someone broke in their window and stole something out of their car. They may feel that nothing's going to happen, so why bother? But if we don't receive those reports, we don't know we have a crime pattern going on in a certain section of the city. I'm sure probably a lot of that happens among the college population in those parking lots or wherever they go to drink or hang out. But we need to know where crime's occurring so we can formulate programs to stop crime, to defeat crime. So all of that is essential to formulate a strategic plan which will make the quality of life better for all residents of Fargo. Thank you.
Thank you. And our third and final question for the opening discussion will begin with Stacy Kelly. Stacy, as the Fargo Police Chief, how can you ensure employees in a supervisory role are held to the same standard as those who are not? How can a line-level employee voice their concerns without facing formal or informal repercussions?
Thank you. So first and foremost, while I was reviewing your policies, I did not see any disciplinary action set out in policy in writing. And then talking to the internal affairs sergeant, when things are filed, it was up to the chief of, number one, whether or not it was going to be a complaint, and then number two, once it was completed, what the punishment was going to be. So one of the first things I would do is work with human resources and come up with a good policy that outlines behaviors, the bad behaviors, and what they would be, maybe like a group system. You know, if you receive a complaint, that's a group 1, it equals this sort of discipline. Excessive force could be a group 3, that's termination. You know, it's somewhere in the middle so the officers know where they stand and it's not a surprise. And then everyone is held accountable. Just as police officers are held more accountable than citizens when it comes to behavior, I expect my command staff to be above and beyond officers. They need to lead by example. They don't get any buys. There's not a separate investigation process for the command staff. They're held to the exact same standards as the officers. As far as concerns, I would keep an open door with the officers, and the open door doesn't mean they can walk into my office at any time because I know they're not going to do that. I have to make myself available to them, be out in their workspaces, build those relationships, doing ride-alongs, going to briefings, and be open to being pulled aside and say, hey, Chief, we got this going on. And also make sure that the command staff and the officers understand if anything like that is brought to their attention, it is handled with the utmost confidence and it's brought straight to us to take action upon. This is going to take time to build the trust. I picked up on that during our tour yesterday, that there was a little bit of a double standard feeling in the department based on the questions that are received and some other feedback. So that will need to be tackled first, and I really think having the clear objectives for everyone out there, clear and concise, will be the first step for that. So, thank you.
Thank you. And next, John.
Yes, ma'am.
As the Fargo Police Chief, how can you ensure employees in a supervisory role are held to the same standard as those who are not? How can a line-level employee voice their concerns without facing formal or informal repercussions?
Okay. As Stacy said, you've got to build trust within all of the ranks, and whoever's your next chief has to work hard at that. You've got to go out. Where I've been chief for two different agencies, I always went out on the street for an hour each day, responded to calls with the officers, rode with officers, patrolmen, sergeants, lieutenants, getting to know everybody. And after a while, you'll develop that trust. Getting out in the, like Stacy said, they're not going to come into your office. They're kind of intimidated by the office of the chief. So you've got to go out and outreach to them. Make sure they understand, here's my number. You can call me at any time, whatever's going on. If you feel you need to call me or see me, let me know. Again, like Stacy said, looking over your policies, I noticed we didn't have an ironclad disciplinary policy. A gentleman yesterday during my question and answer session with the troops felt that he had no appeal process to be able to voice an appeal on minor discipline. Maybe he received a reprimand, maybe he received a day of suspension, felt it was unfair. There was no way he could challenge minor disciplinary action taken against him. That has to change. You got to build trust among all the ranks. And as Stacy also said, you got to hold your command staff accountable, that they're working just as hard as you are as the chief to make sure everybody feels they have a stake in it, and also that they feel that they have a voice, that they at least will be heard. They may not like the outcome, but at least they'll be heard. Progressive discipline. Every agency should have progressive discipline, starting from something as small as an admonishment, if it's a really minor thing, all the way up to termination. I know that you do have a civil service commission here where they can appeal serious disciplinary action taken against them. I think just about everyone has that, and that's good. But you've got to have progressive discipline. You just can't arbitrarily give somebody a day who's never had a disciplinary history, or 5 days, or 10 days. That seeds nothing but distrust, anger, and hostility, and it will build within your agency. You've got to be fair about discipline. Discipline has to be fair, and it has to be a very thorough process. I think I talked earlier about a complaint review panel consisting of all ranks, patrolman, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, where upon a complaint is sustained against an officer, and they will come up with a recommendation to provide to me, the chief, what they feel is a fair amount of discipline regarding the allegation that's been sustained against the officer. Now, I, as the chief, would have the opportunity to either lower it if I felt their recommendation was too high, or not concur, where I would write a reply to it as to why I'm justifying giving someone more disciplinary action than what the panel recommended. But all those things need to be implemented to make sure that your disciplinary process is fair and that everybody feels that it treats everyone fairly. Thank you.
Thank you. And David, as the Fargo Police Chief, how can you ensure employees in a supervisory role are held to the same standard as those that are not? How can a line-level employee voice their concerns without facing formal or informal repercussions?
Thank you. In terms of accountability, accountability in Beloit is one of our values, and as part of our vision, mission, and value teamwork that we would do within Fargo PD, it would be evaluating and establishing our core values. So we have that right there, that we require ethical, accountable leadership at all levels of the organization. So there is no question that regardless of your role or rank, you have to stay on the playing field. You have to follow policy, and if not, you'll face discipline. I've been in the position where I've had to demote, remove, have command level personnel, supervisory personnel, demote, resign, or terminated. So I don't have any issue doing that, although it's not something anyone enjoys doing, but it's necessary to maintain the integrity of our department and retain community trust. We have policy in place that guides our personal complaint process, which the chief is the decision maker, but the command staff and the supervisors are the ones who conduct the investigation. So they're provided training and guidance on that. And all matters are looked into, and there's an opportunity then to, once we delve into the details, write in policy to discern how do we want to address it, how do we want to change that behavior. And so instead of a rules-based approach, which I am not in favor of, such as matrices and so forth, because I think they discount a lot of other things that are involved in certain situations, I take a values-based approach, write in policy, and with the details of the investigation, look at what the employee's motivation was. And again, going back to, was this a well-intentioned act on the part of this officer that went awry? Which is very much different from an officer who did a malicious act, or an officer who had a ministerial duty and they didn't do it, and they just didn't do it. Those are much more severe, and some of them are terminable, severable. I can't help certain people in certain situations, but the idea is to change behavior and guide and lead our department. So that motivation is one piece. Degree of harm, what's the degree of harm? And not necessarily dollar amount or injury, although that could be a part of it. But degree of harm also comes into play. What's the degree of harm to our community trust and relationship? Did this officer do something that really affects that or could affect that? And that's obviously a larger consideration as we look at what's appropriate to change the behavior. What's the experience level of the officer? Many of our departments in Beloit and here in Fargo, from what I can see, we have a lot of young cops. And we ask a lot of our young officers. Folks out there that are familiar with science will tell you, right, your brain doesn't fully develop till 25. At 21, we give people guns and give them a lot of training and send them out there with our best wishes and intentions. They're in a lot of stressful, dynamic situations, and so we have to take into account what their experience level is. And a new officer is much more likely to make a well-intentioned mistake or error as opposed to a veteran officer who I would expect to know better and again would hold to a higher level of accountability. And then lastly, prior disciplinary record of the officer. I would agree from a progressive discipline perspective that if our efforts to change that behavior aren't successful, that at some point the discipline has to increase or they no longer can be a part of our organization. So that's a kind of approach in terms of accountability. It's right in our policy, and that would become part of the policy here in Fargo. And I think that's something that the department members and officers understand and can aspire to. In terms of how we handle line level issues, as part of my transition process, I meet one-on-one with every person in this department. I explained this to the staff yesterday in some of our meetings because I want to know something about all of them, what their goals are, et cetera, but also so that they understand the expectations of myself as chief and how I see our department being run and what we need to do to be efficient and effective. In Wisconsin, we have a union environment, and I immediately, upon becoming chief, set up monthly meetings with the union board so that I would have insight into line officers' concerns and issues. Once a month we meet and address those and have successfully resolved a number of issues. While we do have a chain of command, I am well aware that sometimes everything doesn't make it through the chain of command. So I have that direct link with our officers. And here in Fargo, as discussed yesterday with a lot of the staff, I would not create a union environment, but I would certainly set up shift representation from within the various areas of the department so that we could have at their discretion monthly, bi-monthly meetings and address concerns or issues that maybe I'm unaware of.
Thank you. So for the committee members, we are actually running well ahead of schedule. So I would encourage you, if you have any follow-up questions based on our opening topics, please ask those follow-up questions now.
You must have all done a great job.
Okay, are there any follow-up questions at this time? No? All right, well, you did do a great job. Thank you, gentlemen. We'll have you head back up to the Human Resources Office, and then David, you will be the first to present, and we'll have your interview. So we'll have you come back down in just a couple of minutes after a short break for our committee, and we'll help you to get set up.
Sounds good.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so our next activity in the assessment today is a presentation by David Zabalski. And you have, again, a copy of the presentation in your assessment packet. But unless there are any questions, we are ready to begin.
Okay, thank you. I just want to start off by just quickly acknowledging and thanking the members of the selection committee for all your time and efforts. I know this is a pretty involved process, but I think as a candidate, I certainly appreciate all of the due diligence that you're doing in making this very important selection. So moving along to my transition process that you asked about, and I've done this in a couple of different organizations. I know you asked for 90 days, I start pre-90 days. So from accepted offer to day one in office, I'm already working and getting things lined up in the organization. Number one, and I had an opportunity to do this yesterday as well, which was great, meet with the command staff as a group, explain my transition process, what my expectations are, address any of their immediate concerns and needs. The big thing, reduce uncertainty and build relationships. As you can imagine, a lot of people in the department are unsure what's the new person going to do and how are they going to operate. So that's a big thing from my perspective to set at ease right away and start working forward. A couple things I want them to start working on: mental health and peer support for officers, which I think is a significant concern, not just in law enforcement in general, but in this department. And we need to start working on what does that process look like. And as I've done in other organizations, I want them to utilize team members from various parts of the organization to start working on that and coming up with a potential plan. Body-worn cameras, obviously a big concern and an immediate need. Again, kudos to the mayor for putting aside money for this very important technology. I think in terms of community transparency and benefits to the officers, it's a huge technology need. I would strongly caution, though, against making a decision on a particular product without additional comparables. And I say that because of my experience implementing the program in Beloit and looking at various technologies and what they have and what they don't have. And in talking to some of the staff yesterday in terms of some of the gaps that I see may be with the current product. Because we're spending significant city dollars, taxpayer dollars, we need to be very prudent in what we're doing. And if we buy a product that won't meet community expectations, we'll find ourselves in another tumultuous situation. Again, I know this from experience as well. And I think, while I won't advocate for a particular product, I'm familiar with one that I think is really great technology and meets those marks. But I want this group to start looking at comparables, costs, so that I can go back to the mayor and have a discussion about whether or not we need to potentially amend the budget once we know what the actual cost might be and have agreed on a product, or if we'll be able to do it with the existing funding. But I, again, would strongly urge that we take a second look at what we're doing on that product. In addition, meeting with the admin assistant. So I got to meet with Patty Swift yesterday, a very nice lady who's in a holding pattern, but upon this accepted offer, she's going to be very busy because I have a transition survey process that I utilize, and I talked to staff about this yesterday. This is how I get to know everyone in the department, but I also get to find out what's going on. What are the issues and concerns? What are the expectations of me? Probably everyone in the department has ideas about efficiencies, or they know things that are occurring that are no longer necessary. They're inefficient, or they don't serve the public well, or things that would help them do their job better. So in terms of command and supervisory staff, they're going to get all of these questions on their survey, which is electronic. We'll go back to Patty, most likely, or myself, so that I can start reviewing these prior to starting in office. And then line staff will get about half of the amount. The key component to these, I guess that doesn't work, okay, is goals in the organization and getting to know what people want or expect or where their aspirations are in our department. As a leader, as the chief, if I don't know what that is, how can I help you gain your potential? How can I help you serve the department and the community better? So this survey is the beginning to the one-on-one conversations that will follow. So Patty will be scheduling some in-person meetings for after day one, along with in-person meeting with some of our community leaders who we have some current trust and relationship issues. This, because of the urgency of the situation, needs to get scheduled and done right away. And I will be meeting with Faith Dixon and West Philome and folks from those two groups to discuss some of the issues and start to establish a relationship. And so as a person walking in with essentially a clean slate. I don't have any relationships in the department. I don't, have any biases one way or the other, except wanting to do the best for the department and the community. Establishing a assumption of goodwill relationship, what I think is extremely important when you're working with community groups, and then going from there with how we can build a relationship, how we can better educate the public and work together as partners going forward. I've done this previously on Beloit as well, and have been very successful at it. So it's, I see that as one of my biggest pieces coming into the position. And also scheduling some listening sessions citywide. So I'll let Patty start rolling that out into the future, but I want to get out into the community in different areas, different neighborhoods, and start to engage folks on their questions and concerns and let them know a little bit about myself as well. Lastly, meeting with Ms. Schindeldigger. Hope I got that one right. But PIO, very important position, and I think the city recognizes that as well. You put a position aside to help with communications. I want that person reporting to me as the chief so that we are in alignment on the messaging and what's going on, especially when we have situations that, as an example, a situation in Moorhead that just occurred the other night, things that may bring additional scrutiny, ire, concern from the community, because I want to know what's going on and we want us to put out a transparent message while maintaining the integrity of any potential investigation, which is also important both for community transparency but for the reputational interest of our officers. Some of these things are not what they seem to be in little segments on social media, and some of them are and need to be addressed. But we have to retain the ability to effectively look into those and address them, and we will. And in some instances, it's more of an explanation and a misunderstanding than an inappropriate use of law enforcement authority. So either way, we'll be in a position to address those. Meet and communicate with the mayor and deputy city administrator, commissioners in terms of any vision that they have about the department, what their greatest concerns might be, so that I can start delving that into our strategic plan. Meet or communicate with Chief Todd. I know he had a strategic plan and he moved along very well. I think a lot of people are pleased with. I don't know if there's pieces that are still undone that need to be done, but I'd like to check in with him and see where we're at in terms of those processes. So as we put together our new strategic plan, and I've done some strategic planning thinking about this department from what I can determine looking at the outside, although I would be better informed as I start to learn more, I can put that next plan together and we can move forward on it. I have to obtain a partial waiver of law enforcement certification. I've already checked into that with the state, so that won't be a problem. And I need to relocate residency for myself and my wife. Obviously, we've had those discussions, and so that pre-90 days is going to be a busy time. I also have to make sure while I'm doing all of that, that I professionally and appropriately transition out of my current position. Obviously, I don't want to leave them in any type of position where things of significance are undone. I've done a lot of work already to put that into place, and I have a good second in command that is up to snuff in terms of any pending issues. So day one in office, I'm ready to start in-person meetings with command and supervisory personnel to follow up on the information I've learned in the surveys. I need to find out who's interested in starting to lead some of our new teams that are going to help form the future culture and operations of this department. Vision, mission, values, art as assessment, recruitment team. We need to expand recruitment quite a bit, and we need to diversify this department. Mental health and peer support. So we want to involve people within our department and actually people within our community. Our assessment and recruitment team at Beloit, we have community members involved in that. Roll call meetings, I'll be out meeting all the staff. Again, I love getting out and talking with the officers and the community and taking Q&A. I will always provide an answer. Sometimes not everyone may like the answer, but the answer will be professionally provided and it will be reasonably and logically based. I will tell you the truth, and just like I will tell the community the truth. There are certain things that people don't understand because it's not something they would know. And so having those conversations are very important. Meeting with the media, I'm sure the media has great interest in who the chief is and what the chief's plans and visions are, so we will arrange those sit-downs with our PIO and get those done. And then having scheduled our meetings, sit down with some of our community partners, Black Lives Matters and One Fargo representatives, to start working on those relationships and moving forward. Potentially amending the budget for the body-worn camera program, and also another piece of important training I think we need to bring here, implicit bias. And I've had the opportunity to do this in Beloit and work with a nationally renowned professor on this, and I am bringing him back to Beloit right now again for a lot of our new officers, but I certainly would look at bringing him here to Fargo and providing that really significant training for our department. After action report, I would really be interested in seeing the after action report on the May 30th unlawful assembly and the damage and things that occurred, so that I have a better understanding of how the department approached the issue, what were some of the things that could be done better, what's the learning point to all of that. So I'll certainly be looking for that after action report so I can review that and see if there's anything we would want to change approach-wise if something like that were to happen in the future. ICAT, another piece of important training, that is integrated communications, assessment, and tactics. That is nationally known and trained de-escalation training. Another important component, I think, for our police department, and it provides officers with a critical decision-making model above and beyond what they would receive in their law enforcement training to provide them options other than deadly use of force. So it's focused on de-escalating incidents that are not firearms related, but they are edged weapons or blunt force, or we have people in mental health or drug or alcohol issues. And officers are trained to think about options to de-escalate and take different paths to accomplish the same goal. At the end of the day, we still may make the arrest. We still may take the person in mental distress into custody and get them treatment. But how we do that and the approach we take has a very important effect on the outcome. And so this training, which is, again, a national model and done in a lot of agencies across the U.S., we've trained everyone in Beloit on this, and I can see from the incidents we've been involved in how it has helped our officers immensely in their decision-making and ability to safely resolve incidents that would otherwise result in officer use of deadly force. Might have to have a little dispensation on out-of-state travel, but I've already spoken with the Police Executive Research Forum, and we would be able to get 2 of our trainers into the Iowa course, and the only cost is travel. They would then come back and train the rest of the department. From there, ongoing, observing departmental processes to assess culture. This is an ongoing task for some time, and it really never stops, but I'll be looking at a number of different things in the department, asking a lot of questions and doing a lot of observing. And I've already asked a lot of questions over the last couple of days, probably to the ad nauseum to some of the folks I've been walking around with, but that's how I understand what's going on, and it's how I determine why we're doing things. And sometimes in an agency, especially if you've been in an agency a long time, we are doing things because we always did them that way, and we never really thought about why anymore. And sometimes it doesn't make sense, or sometimes we should be doing something different. So a large focus on that. 60 to 90 days out, we start focusing on the city and the community, meeting other department heads, learning city processes. There's a number of community groups here in Fargo. I've watched from a distance the Ubuntu Racial Dialogues, which is something we participate in. It's crucial conversations in Beloit. But going to those community groups again and hearing their concerns and creating those relationships, collaborating and being an active participant in the Human Relations Commission We Are One project, that would certainly be something I would be involved in. And then holding these listening sessions which lead into the conversations with community in terms of educating the public on all of these things that we see bring conflict between law enforcement and the public, most of which are avoidable if we have, first of all, an assumption of goodwill and trust, but we also understand what our roles and obligations are. Citizens have roles and obligations, so do law enforcement officers, and we have to appropriately use our authority when we're in those positions. Completing certification, which for me, I will need to take a 2-week course. I've spoke with Officer Berger about this already, so I think he's on that, and that shouldn't be too difficult. Meeting with our community service providers, business and criminal justice partners. Again, a lot of great institutions and a lot of community support here in Fargo, our downtown, our other business associations, or maybe some neighborhood associations that I'm yet unaware of. Boys and Girls Club, I'm a member of our Boys and Girls Club in Beloit. The Y and the YWCA, again, important partners with law enforcement. Our Rape and Abuse Crisis Center, I also serve currently on the Board of Family Services in Beloit. They are the umbrella organization for our domestic violence shelter. So we have connectivity with our department and our domestic violence team, and we instituted LAP as Lethality Assessment Protocol, which is also a national model that helps better assess the potential danger to domestic violence victims. There's a number of key questions that are asked of the victims to determine whether or not they are in graver danger than they may think, and that escalates the response of the domestic violence resource personnel. So we work in partnership with them, and that's been a great project as well. Also reaching out to our university, criminal justice heads and associations, school administrators and school boards in terms of relationships, but also we've got our school resource officers, our community engagement officers, and I think all of these organizations may have some input, insight, or thought about things that have been good with the police department and things that could be better, or suggestions. So those are the kinds of things that I need to know, again, as chief, so that we can start to formulate where the department needs to go and where we need to improve. Obviously, all of the criminal justice partners in the area, and I've done this in Wisconsin for all the organizations I worked in, but I am an active member of our state association, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, where I sit on the mid-size agency board, and the Police Executive Research Forum. So I believe in strong relationships both locally, statewide, and regionally, and nationally with our personnel, so that we can work collaboratively together to accomplish common public safety goals. And at the end, evaluate and assess, because we need to have that. So I need to review and report out to the commission, the mayor, but also staff on what were the findings of this evaluation. What training, resources, and equipment needs or mission confusion I have found in some of my organizations that when I do the survey, some of the officers aren't really sure what their mission is. They're confused. That's a message for me that we need to do something different. Either I need to explain more, or we need to get some people on the right part of the ship. But it's good input for me, and then the officers and the staff need to know what the outcomes of those surveys were. Identify and implement any quick wins or address critical issues. If there's a critical safety issue that I identify, that would be the exception to how I manage change, because I won't let a critical safety issue go unchallenged. It's going to get fixed. I've done this in Beloit, I've done this at the state and in Milwaukee, as well as quick wins. Quick wins are something that I can make the decision on today that's going to alleviate a lot of stress on the officers. As a quick example, when I started in Beloit, I noticed that at the time they had shotguns. The shotguns weren't in the front of the squad. They were in the trunk. I know from my law enforcement experience that when you need a shotgun, you need it right now. You can't go to the trunk and take it out of a case and deploy it because something already happened. And as I did the one-on-ones and the surveys, I found out almost to a person that the reason the shotguns were in the case in the trunk was because the former chief had discovered that in one instance someone had placed gum into the barrel, and that wrecked the gun. So because of that, he took all the guns out. So something as what would seemingly be as ridiculous as that was a quick win for the officers, and how much better did they feel about their own safety. Budgetary needs and preparation for the next fiscal year, what grant opportunities are out there. I know we're in a tight budget timeline, and we may have to think about amending budgets based on the results that we find, but I think that everyone would be open to that for the benefit of the community. And that 120-day report out to the mayor and commission. So that's essentially my transition. And I, as I said before, has done some strategic thinking on the department as well, but I'll see if that comes up. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll pause for just a minute while you take a seat in the center of the dais, and then we'll begin your interview shortly.
We're going to move your chair, so everybody keeps in the same chairs. COVID protocol.
Just your thought.
You know, it's a whole new world.
Thank you.
Okay, we are ready to begin your interview. Jen and I will be asking the questions throughout the interview, and we will rotate asking those questions. We will pause in case the committee members have any follow-up questions for you as well. And a few of these questions are a little bit lengthy, so let us know if you need us to repeat any of the questions as we go.
Sounds good.
All right. So first of all, we'd like to have you tell us about your leadership style and how it has changed and developed as you've gained more experience as a leader in law enforcement.
My leadership style is heavily based on the ability to influence human behavior. And that is best done through building relationships versus legitimate authority. Sometimes we have to use legitimate authority, both inside of our organizations and externally with the community, but the ability to build and garner relationships provides more influence and it makes you less reliant on having to use legitimate types of authority. And with that is the expectation that all of our personnel are leaders. So everyone from myself to the records clerk is a leader in our organization, and they have responsibilities not only to the department but the community. They are looked upon by the community and in the various ranks and roles as leaders. And the decisions they make can greatly affect the lives of others. And that's why the work that we do at all levels of the police department is so important, and that's why it gets appropriate scrutiny and undergo a lot of questions and things of that nature. So it's a dispersed leadership style. I believe in pushing down decision-making to the lowest level possible, wrapped around the theory that everyone ascribes and understands what the vision, mission, and core values are of the department. I don't believe that micromanaging or doing things of that nature are productive, and they also don't help us develop our personnel. Along with that, I take a strong approach and interest in developing, leading, guiding all of our personnel, individually, as teams within the department, and as an organization. And that team also includes the community, working with them and making that team larger. Again, I think it's extremely important that we understand what personnel value and that they know that they are valued and respected for the work that they do, and that internally and externally with our community, everyone is treated with dignity and respect. That's a standard philosophy. It's also another pillar of procedural justice. Everyone wants to be treated respectfully. And so we ask that internally and also within our community. As we develop personnel, putting them into positions and creating opportunities for them to excel is also extremely motivational. And as you know, this position, this career is extremely stressful, but it's also extremely rewarding as long as people know they're valued, they're respected, they have opportunities to succeed, and they're properly rewarded. So you want to reward the behavior that you want to instill, the behavior that you want to see occur. And that's why discipline is also important, because if you're rewarding the wrong behavior by not taking disciplinary action in an issue, you are telling everyone else that that behavior is okay. It's okay at any level of the organization. So I take very seriously that responsibility and that view of how the organization needs to run. How my leadership style has developed, it's really developed over the course of my 36 years. When I started, I guess I've always have had and still do have a very strong passion for law enforcement. I believe in what we do, and I believe in the importance of what we do, as well as how important it is to our community. And I think the development over the years, progressing through the ranks and working in the different organizations, certainly my work with the ICP and the Leadership Police Organizations program was really some great insight into human behavior, which was something as a new officer I'd never been exposed to. I was reliant on legitimate authority because we didn't have any other kind of training or insight from the science or anything of that nature to help guide us. And so my payback and my passion is to take that knowledge and skills and abilities and continue to develop the next generation of law enforcement officers and to come in and to work with departments and communities to make those relationships stronger. I firmly believe that regardless of what anyone may say, law enforcement will never go away. Their importance of their role is not severable. Roles and responsibilities in what we do may change, but we are an important component of any community and its public safety. And so, again, in terms of development, I progressed through a lot of different organizations. Beloit was extremely challenging. I had about 10 days' notice to drop into an organization that the chief and deputy chief had been walked out the door. I didn't know anything about. I knew there was a lot of problems. There had been an investigation by Hillard and Heinz, an outside agency, and it was a pretty scathing report. And you had a bunch of officers who, not of their own accord, but were the victims of failed leadership. And because of that, they really weren't doing what they should have been doing. They didn't have the right focus on crime. Crime was out of control. They didn't have the right internal mechanisms or checks and balances to ensure things were done properly. They weren't being developed at all for any future positions. And that was a big challenge. And I went in there and took that on because, again, of my passion and commitment to our profession and our communities. And in 5 years, that department looks nothing like it did 5 years ago. And I'm extremely proud of all of those personnel that are working there today who have accepted the challenge. We've hired a lot of new officers under our vision, mission, and values that they aspire to every day, and it's how we hold ourselves accountable. And it really brands the department, and along with that has garnered greater community support and cooperation. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So many police departments operate under a paramilitary
Jen, I have a follow-up
command
question.
structure. Is this the right structure for police departments in 2020? Oh, excuse me. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Are we doing follow-up questions now? Okay, sorry, yes, go ahead.
Chief, you mentioned micromanaging. Do you have a philosophy or a specific example how you combated that in an agency or a person?
Well, again, reward the behavior you want and handle the behavior you don't want. So the expectations to my command staff and all the way down from supervision when we do our training and development of those personnel is the idea that we want them to be able to think on their own and problem solve. The three biggest things that we need to have skill-wise: problem solving, judgment, and decision making. And sometimes, as in Beloit, they were never trained that way, and it was a big shock for them to have to do that. And then with that, you had people that micromanaged and did everything for someone else. So that's just conduct that I not only lay out in my expectations as unwanted, it's discouraged. If I see it, we address it. But I really expect our personnel to understand and properly fulfill their role and responsibility. So it's really, it can be formal or informal, but it's all about watching what's going on, who's doing what. And I think in a lot of the informal conversations is how you may become aware of something like that. But I really think that, again, pushing down decision-making to the lowest level is important and giving people the ability to work in that values-based playing field. As long as they're on the field, I want them to innovate and come up with different solutions to problems. We want to be able to solve problems, and the same response is not always going to work. So if we don't give them that latitude, we have boxed ourselves in.
Any other follow-up questions? Okay. So many police departments operate under a paramilitary command structure. Is this the right structure for police departments in 2020 and into the future? How do you think the internal command structure affects the overall culture and morale of the police department? If you think there is a better approach to leadership within police departments, please describe.
Well, we do have a paramilitary structure in law enforcement. I think it is appropriate because you do have to have command and control. And I think without that, you are an agency fluttering without guidance. Equally, if not more important, though, is that the people that are in those command and control positions have to understand vision, mission, and values of the department. They have to utilize and apply their roles effectively, which is not only performing what the expectations of their function are, but making sure that their direct reports understand what they need to do and developing and guiding them along the way to get to a common goal. I don't think that, in fact, I have a very strong opinion about, I experienced this as well, departments in which command staff specifically have very personal relationships with others in the department to the extent it affects the integrity of department operations. I don't believe that command staff or officers should be addressing their supervisors by nicknames or first names in a public venue. I think when you're having an individual private meeting, things are a little more relaxed for purposes of discussion, but I think it's important that the decorum and the professionalism is modeled in the department. If every officer thinks that they can address someone of higher rank by some nickname or a first name, I think we have lost the decorum and respect, and I think that needs to be maintained, because when we have to be placed in a position of potentially investigating a personnel complaint or internal investigation, those personal relationships, I'm sure we're all aware, will come into play. It's very hard for someone to discipline someone that they're friends, buddies, pals with, and they will do a disservice to the department because of that, and that will send the wrong message. So I'm not aware of any other structure that I think would be appropriate. I think that, again, not from an authoritarian stance in any way. I don't want people to overuse or abuse their legitimate authority, but I think you have to have that command and control structure, and everyone has to understand what their roles and responsibilities are and fulfill them.
Follow up? Do you see that there is a way to integrate non-paramilitary methods into the structure that you just described? Like the social worker, for example. If you,
Absolutely.
You know, like,
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you for that. Okay. Yeah, no, in terms of partnership, and command and control has to do with basic functions and operations of the department, but most certainly I'm a huge proponent of engaging mental health professionals, social worker professionals into our operations, because it's going to probably lead to better outcomes. And that's a whole other avenue for us to explore. Oftentimes it becomes a staffing and budgetary issue. I would completely support that, and a lot of departments have done that. And that's fine, with the caveat that everyone understands that doesn't negate the need for us to train all of our officers in crisis intervention, in de-escalation, because at the drop of a hat at 3 a.m, we're going to send to that call. We might not have the social worker or mental health professional with us. So I think to the extent, breadth and depth that we can do that, that most certainly those are things that we should be exploring and integrating in as we're able to do so.
Thank you.
In light of recent events, what have you learned from incidents around the country related to protests and riots? As the Fargo Police Chief, how would you support the right to a peaceful protest while protecting a city from individuals who use the peaceful event as an opportunity to incite a riot? What steps would you take to try to prevent violence and rioting?
Thank you. Yeah, I do have some experience here as well, and this is a big issue here in Fargo as well as nationally. I am a firm believer in constitutional policing and the ability for people to express their First Amendment rights. And I think the extent to which the department can work with them to facilitate that, just as we did in Beloit, we had some protests. I think that in my outside view of Fargo, you did have some outside elements that adversely affected how those protests ended up. We were fortunate in Beloit because I think mostly we had local, regional persons who were there protesting, and they did, while they obviously had a large amount of emotion and legitimate concern and understanding that, largely protested peacefully. But we did help them along the way. We let them, if they were walking in the road, we provided some obviously traffic security for them. We don't want to see anything happen to them. And I think it's really all about the relationship with the organizers of those groups, because we were able to communicate with them, and we're here to keep you safe, but at some point we can't shut down modes of transportation for everyone else in the community. And I think what gets lost sometimes is the right of peaceful protest is a right, but everyone else that's not protesting also has constitutional rights to free egress and to travel. And while they may sometimes be interrupted as a result of these protests, if properly managed in cooperation with the police and those groups, that's not that big of an inconvenience. But certainly we can't shut down main thoroughfares for extended period of time, I don't think, in the interest of peaceful protest. That's a discussion with those organizers. So there's I think a fine line there between, in terms of protecting everyone's constitutional freedoms. And to support that. In Beloit, we've met with our organizers and we've had a lot of these discussions, and our protests have gone well. We've been asked to participate in some of them. Otherwise, we did not unless we were asked, because understanding that these groups did have a lot of anger and concern as a result of especially the George Floyd incident, that we didn't want to, I guess from a micromanaging perspective, we didn't want to insert ourselves where we weren't wanted. But once invited, we did participate, and then we've had discussions since then. In terms of the criminal activity, the rioting that's occurred under the camouflage of peaceful protest, I think that absolutely we have to be in a position to address that. Now it's very difficult. I've been involved in discussions already with the International Association of Chiefs of Police and the Police Executive Research Forum about these particular instances, because I recognize, as do other chiefs, I think, that the tools and tactics that law enforcement has in dealing with these events are kind of dated. And in some instances where we have outside influences, we're being outmaneuvered from a counterintelligence perspective, because those folks have a different agenda. They are more interested in debasing, damaging, or causing havoc within our communities and our cities and our businesses, and not peaceful protest, but they hide behind the cloak of peaceful protest. And so some of the discussions that I brought up and that we've been talking about is, first of all, someone needs to come up with some better technology. When we're trying to disperse crowds, and that's a whole other discussion as well in terms of curfew, is there a value to setting a curfew if the crowd is peaceful? I would say, as long as they're a peaceful crowd, why would the police engage in dispersing them at 11 p.m.? Again, we're placed in a position where if they don't want to leave, we don't have many options. So we use tear gas or CS, or in some instances, if they're violent, the rubber bullet. There's been a lot of approaches across the U.S., but I kind of have an issue with that, and I think that's a discussion, obviously, with city leadership in terms of that issue. But in terms of the obvious criminal activity that's occurring, the other discussions we're having is technology and tactics. I think that we have an obligation, and if you watch in some of the cities where people are actually in danger while a building is burning and law enforcement is holding a line, that's what we've been trained to do. So no fault of the officers. I don't fault anyone for that, but I look at it from a police leadership perspective and go, we've been doing that same thing for a long time. And there's people down the street in this building that's now on fire, and no one's helping them. And they're calling 911, and no one's getting there. I firmly believe, and this is the discussion we're having, is we need to relook at those tactics. We have to have the ability to protect our public, even when something like that's happening. And the tactics maybe need to be different. We need to have the ability to, maybe we don't worry about the line. Let's have a different team that's at least going out and trying to rescue people who are otherwise in danger, or in which significant property damage is going to occur. Because while I would agree that a building can be replaced, the other side of the coin is at what cost? And as we've seen in some of these criminal types of riots and protests, things of that nature have only emboldened and made them worse. Groups who have seen that cities are willing to give up significant infrastructure didn't stop there and go, okay, let's call it a day. They continued to take more infrastructure. In Seattle and Portland, they're occupying parts of their city. That is not acceptable. It's not acceptable to me. I doubt it's acceptable to the city leadership or our community. And so I think we have to be in a position to address that. I think that Fargo did do a very good job in terms of utilizing the National Guard, which is another effective tool to protect infrastructure, because I do think that's important, not only from the cost, but I think from the symbolism. And if that symbolism is going to cause more criminal and riotous activity, then there's no value in surrendering it when we don't need to. And I think so. I think there's a lot of future discussions to be had at the local level in Fargo is what our approach would be, but also at the national level and law enforcement in general and how these things should be better addressed.
I have a follow-up.
Yes.
One of my concerns is that I wonder if some of the not really well-intentioned individuals are being given more voice than might be warranted, in that they may not represent the folks that are in a similar community. I'm just wondering if the right voices are always the ones being listened to.
Yeah, well, and that's a difficult thing to discern. But I think going back to the relationship building with our local leaders and building that relationship and having a sense of understanding, I think puts us in a position to maybe understand who is sincerely interested in trying for positive change and who is interested in other agenda items and taking appropriate actions from there. But yeah, it's hard to tell from afar. But I do remember watching one of the videos of the incident that happened downtown and the extreme disconcertation by a couple of the people. There's one guy watching someone start a fire and break windows, and he's screaming at him, "Why are you doing this? That's not why we're here." And so, I mean, legitimately, I think we all understand that these legitimate protests are being overtaken. And I think there's a lot of thought and discussion that has to be put into how we address that so that we can have peaceful protests, but we don't have all these other criminal activities going on.
Okay, so morale is a common issue in law enforcement agencies. The Fargo Police Department has experienced issues with morale as well. What methods have you used in previous leadership positions to measure employee engagement, satisfaction, or morale? In general, what strategies do you believe are most effective to maintain employee engagement, overall satisfaction, and positive morale within the police department?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, morale is important, obviously, in the work that our officers do, and I look at it really from a motivational perspective. Performance, which is what we're all seeking for our personnel, we want to have high-performing teams, is measured by motivation times ability. Motivation mostly comes from within. We have to have people that are here for the right reasons, and that's all part of the recruitment, background vetting process, making sure that we have people that are committed to the values of our department and our profession, and they're willing to commit, not just commit, but innovate from there and utilize that, their internalization of our values. The other part of motivation comes from the organization. So I have to create an environment in which people feel comfortable making mistakes in the interest of improvement, comfortable reporting things that are wrong, unethical, illegal, etc., but that they are also supported when they do good work. And so I often send letters of recognition. I watch what's going on even from my position as chief, and really ask our command officers to do the same thing, that when good work is done, my admin assistant's going to send you a letter of recognition. It's not going to be necessarily an award situation, but just, again, I think that helps the feeling that they are valued and respected in the organization. And so we do that. We also have an awards system, and we created awards, again, for the right kind of conduct, the behavior that we want to enforce. So when we have situations that our officers safely resolve without the use of force or without the use of deadly force that could have otherwise gone that direction, that's an award worth significant recognition. And we have an annual award event, which we invite our community to, and we recognize all of that good work so that those who are doing that same good work are incentivized. This is the direction I want to go. I see what the department recognizes and I see what's valued. And they feel respected and valued, and that has a lot to do with morale. Facility-wise, you have a great facility, so I think that's a morale booster. I really was impressed with the police department facility, the amount of room and space for growth and functionality. That's huge, I think, in terms of department morale. Leadership support is another big one. And as I told them yesterday, I'll 100% stand behind any officer or member of this department that is doing the right thing, even if it went bad. I don't have a problem doing that. I've done that before. I will stand in the face of adversity in the interest of doing the right things for the right reasons. But if you're not doing the right things for the right reasons, I can't stand behind you. Now, how we address that is, again, an evaluation of what we discussed earlier. Why did this happen? Why did you do it? But I think the officers need to know that, especially in today's climate. And I am not afraid, and I have done on many occasions, address these issues with our community. And again, based on having a good relationship, we're able to sit down and have discussions about things that would seemingly appear to be not good or inappropriate, or maybe even they think illegal, and working through what actually happened and breaking it down for them to show them that that wasn't the case. If it is, obviously we take appropriate action. But oftentimes it's a misperception or misunderstanding, and there's never an explanation to the community. There's got to be that open and transparency and that communication so that everyone's on the same level of understanding. In terms of employee engagement, kind of as I discussed before, I am a big proponent of involving people at all levels of the organization in different things, from peer support to vision, mission, values, to assessment and recruitment. I'd love to see a team on this department that's interested and committed to future IT, a group that, and I will help facilitate this, looks at what future IT is out there for law enforcement and has the ability, because a lot of these companies that develop technology always are looking for pilot organizations to try it. So why not be a pilot organization? That's how we got a lot of our great technology and improvements over the years. So I've done that. I would really like to do that here, and I'm sure there's interested people that would want to be a part of that particular team. So again, keeping them engaged in things that interest them above and beyond their day-to-day routine, I think greatly enhances morale and participation.
As the chief of police, you lead a command staff who are responsible for oversight of divisions of the department. How do you engage your command staff to lead in a way that supports your overall strategy while engaging, inspiring, and informing the officers who work in their divisions?
Well, the cornerstone of our organizations, as I've done at the state level in Milwaukee and in Beloit, is the whole leadership philosophy. And we've had actually some officers who have been through the 3-week LPO program. All of our command staff, supervisors, and a lot of our officers and even civilian staff in Beloit have attended that course as well. So I open it up to the entire organization because I want everyone to understand the leadership philosophy and how they can best influence human behavior, because they all have the same issues. So that's the cornerstone, and within that 3-week course are wrapped around a lot of the issues that you're talking about in terms of how you effectively lead, as well as how you effectively follow. We're all followers. We all have to report to someone as well, and the importance of that relationship. But it's in terms of rewarding the right behavior, recognizing good behavior, it's really just reinforced at my level and on down through my command staff. This will obviously take some time depending on where all of these folks are, but job one is obviously getting them into this 3-week leadership program, which we will be able to do without any issue. Obviously, that's another potential budget concern, but I was able to really leverage relationships and budget in Beloit, and we have a large portion of our department that's been through that. And at the state level, we trained, over my 4 years there, thousands of law enforcement officers across the state, and that really starts to build that philosophy within organizations.
Great, thank you. How would you work to educate yourself on the racial and social economical inequalities at a local, state, and national level? And how do you think those factors will influence your leadership of our police force?
Would you give me one more repeat on that one, please?
Sure. How have you worked to educate yourself on the racial and socioeconomic inequalities of a local, state, and national level? And how do you think these factors will influence your leadership of our police force?
Sure. Well, one of, I think, my responsibilities is to be well-informed, to be well-read, and to participate at a lot of different levels. And not only locally with our communities and our local government, but regionally and nationally. The IACP, the Police Executive Research Forum, deal with these issues on a regular basis. I've attended a lot of conferences, phone call meetings, et cetera, discussing these different issues and different approaches. In terms of the inequities, I think we have to acknowledge as a profession the historical context that law enforcement, the relationships law enforcement has had with some of our minority communities and low socioeconomic communities. And I think the acknowledgement of that history is an important piece in our ability to, again, build a relationship and move forward, ensuring that we're doing everything that we can to eliminate any disparities or inequities going forward. And we can't change the past, we can't deny the past, but we also have to recognize that the men and women that are serving us today weren't here for that. But we do wear that history as part of our profession. We also have the obligation to take our profession and our service to the community to the next level. And so it's been very successful in my leadership experience to address those with different community groups, work through them, and start to build partnerships going forward. There's a number of ways to do that. In Wisconsin, we also have community justice coordinating councils at the state and county level. And I participate on that in Rock County, as well as our evidence-based decision-making team. And this is these are groups of criminal justice and community persons across the board who are looking at some of these issues and conducting research and trying to come up with solutions, concepts, ideas to address them, and not only address inequities, but misperceptions as well, and to clear those things up so that we can move forward together as partners. So I'm not only participating at those different levels, but I think also looking at literature. There's a lot of science in terms of disparities and equities, and a lot of books out there that I've read that help inform my decision making, and I think give me a better understanding of some of the inequities of the past and how we can best address them. And again, that message is something that I pass down to my leadership team, and I encourage them to be as well versed in it as I am, so that they, again, are at that same level and we're working from the same page.
All right, you've touched on our next question, but we'd like to have you describe your experience gathering and tracking police department data to maintain an equitable police force in regards to race, homelessness, income, and other demographic factors. How has this data been collected and analyzed in police departments you have led? And how have you utilized this data in your department's operations and strategic plans?
Well, I am a strong believer in data, intelligence-led types of decision-making. In Beloit, I joined on early to the Police Data Initiative, which was an initiative that came out of the White House at the time as part of the President's 21st Century Task Force report, which addressed a number of pillars and suggestions for law enforcement improvement. We took that report and embedded it into our organization, and in addition, joined the Police Data Initiative. So our data is online for public consumption in terms of use of force, in terms of our crime statistics. We're working on traffic stop data. We ran into a little IT inhibitor there, but I think that information needs to be out in the public venue, and I think it helps understanding as well. And when you look at just our use of force data for someone from the general public to view, they would see that out of about 54,000 calls for service, our department utilized force 117 times. And about 70% of those encounters were nothing more than just getting someone's hands behind their back or setting them against a stabilization technique so that we could handcuff them. And I think what's important about the data and the way it's utilized in the department and how it's viewed in the public is what you count. Obviously, there's a large difference in what different agencies may do in terms of counting use of force. At the federal level, all they want to know is, did you kill someone or did you shoot them and they didn't die? Or did you have none? And that's the extent to which the federal government collects use of force data. At our state level, they ask for a few more things. Within our department, we have instituted that we will count everything. We want to know anytime an officer has to resort to any level of force. That's reported, that's scrutinized, but it also tells us where we need to improve. Part of it also shows, we also track when we've had to use force and whether or not the person had a mental health issue or a drug and alcohol issue, because we know that there's a difference between those folks who may not have the ability to understand what we're trying to accomplish, and we end up having to use force to complete the act, as opposed to someone who does not have those issues and intentionally chooses not to comply with the lawful directive of the officer. I view those differently as well. But I think that tracking that, number one, the officers know that we track it. We know that it's scrutinized. So I think just like body cameras and the training we provide them, they are adept and have in the back of their heads that they need to be trying to do things the right way because it's being watched and it's being monitored. And from a community perspective, we're able to report out to our community here. Here's what happened in the last year in terms of our use of force, and here's all the different categories that we report. And we've done this at community conversations. I've had our fence and arrest tactics and some of our commanders come out and provide the report and answer questions with the community so they can understand what some of our terminology means in layman terms, because a lot of the things they may look at online may not give them complete context to what we're talking about. In terms of homelessness, we've worked with our county homeless coalition to try and address those situations, and there's a lot of literature out there as well that I've reviewed and have made suggestions on to our county to better improve things for homeless personnel, persons rather. And there's a difference between the facilities that are offered in a community. Most cities offer just a dry facility, which means you can't come into our facility unless you are not under the influence of alcohol or drugs. I think anecdotally, most of us would recognize that a large portion of homeless persons do have alcohol and drug issues along with mental health. So they can never get into a dry facility. They can't get into that shelter. And there's no what's called a wet facility availability. And so in some cities, and there's a lot of literature on this, they have created wet facilities, collaborative wet facilities where the goal is we accept these people in so they're not sleeping on our streets. And I've done a lot of walking around town, and I see the issue, but it's not unlike any other city. But providing a wet facility, so let's get these folks off the streets, and they work towards addressing their issues to get them to a dry facility. And then the ultimate goal is obviously getting them a place to live, getting them a job, and moving them along so they're productive members of society. But I think you have to have that other component, and I have argued strongly with our county, and I have not been successful, mostly because I guess of the budgetary implications, but that is very doable, and the literature is out there, and I'm well aware of it, and we would be willing to work with any of our community partners along those lines. Income, I've not tracked income, so that's not something that we track other than I guess recognizing that some of our neighborhoods are low socioeconomic in nature, and I know there's always a concern there when police take action or patrol in that area that we don't over-police those neighborhoods. And what I have done in Beloit is when I started, there was a huge reliance on issuing tickets and sending people to municipal court and getting those revenues to help support city services. I think we all recognize that is a bad plan, and that's not a sustainable plan. And the people least likely to pay those fines are living in those low socioeconomic areas. So where are we going? And after they didn't pay their fine, the process was they would get arrested on a commitment warrant and they would go to the county jail. And we, the city, would pay $55 a day to keep them in jail for a fine they couldn't pay. This is a lose-lose proposition. So I immediately started tamping down, focus on, that was a big focus when I started. We stopped doing that. When I started in Beloit, our budget to house people for non-payment of fines was about $180,000. We were paying that much a year to the county to house people who could not pay fines. Ridiculous outcome. We are now down to about $40,000 in expenditures this year because, first of all, it's not our focus. We don't do it if we don't have to. And I was also successful in convincing our municipal court to look at other avenues I know you have a process here for working in certain city areas to repay fines, and I think those approaches, or in some instances, if people are working garnishment and taking those types of actions, are much better outcomes than trying to jail people for not paying fines. So we had some success there in Beloit. I think there's obviously always room for that type of an approach here in Fargo as well.
Follow up?
Yes, sir.
So I think you addressed homelessness and the income. Can you address the racial part of the data collection?
Yes.
Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, and that's the other part of our police data initiative, is breaking those numbers down. As I said, I wanted to have our traffic stops, and we could do this with our use of force now, and then that's actually being worked on. I think that's an important tool. And I think people need to see what the racial makeups are of all of those police activities. The caveat to that, though, is the understanding, and again, this goes back to we have to have an assumption of goodwill and a good relationship, is that crime and traffic stops and all those things don't happen. They are not commensurate with demographics of a population. People don't commit crime based on the percentage of any demographic. It just doesn't happen. It's not valid science. But I understand that there are some areas that may have too much activity, and they do contain people of color who feel they're over-policed, and that's an issue to deal with. So, same thing with traffic. You have people flowing through this community that don't even live here. So there is no scientifically valid way to measure that, because in order to measure disparity, which could equate to bias, and some people would say, well, if there's disparity, there's bias. That's not a valid premise either. We don't know that there's bias just because there's disparity. We will see disparity in the numbers. It's like if you look at any organization or any actions that are taken. But we have to look further into the context of that, okay? So if we see the numbers, and it looks to be disproportionately affecting a particular group. All right. Now let's look at where those stops occurring. I think what happens is we're not delving deep enough into the issue to find real answers. Where are those stops occurring? Okay, now are they happening in one area of town, and is there a particular unnecessary focus there? Again, going to our low socioeconomic areas. Are we spending too much time? Are we writing too many tickets to those folks who can't otherwise pay? Although, again, understanding that there is a responsibility that we can't have people driving around town who don't have licenses, who crash into other people and or cause other incidents. So there is a melding there of obligations and responsibilities on both sides. But I think in terms of your race question, it has a lot to do with the trust and respect for what law enforcement does, because the numbers, without any other context, will lead to that perception. In some cases, there could be truth to that perception, but we need to delve down further. Where are those stops being made? Who's making those stops? And so what we're working on doing is evaluating from that the work of individual officers. And in Milwaukee, we did this as well in terms of who's writing citations, where are they writing citations. And as you delve down into it, you might find that the officer was doing what we expect them to do. They were in the area that we needed them because that's where certain crimes were being committed. There is a lot of research out there that says that an increase in traffic stops has an effect on the reduction of crime. That doesn't mean that we need to stop every car and issue every ticket. And so what we've done in Beloit is I put a big focus from the beginning on, again, it's like changing behavior. We want the motoring public to be compliant, just like with crimes. So we don't need to write a ticket every time. We write more warnings than we write citations, and that data is available as well. So while we're still making the stop, we're trying to change the motoring behavior. So unless it's necessary to write that ticket, we're going to write the warning. Obviously, if we stop someone who doesn't have a license or is revoked or has some other warrants, that's an issue that's outside of our control. In terms of complaints about that, that's where our body cams and our dash cams have been very significant. because of historical context or because of past experiences that people may have had either in our jurisdiction in Beloit or another jurisdiction, or we have a large new American population here, their experiences are different. They may think that, hey, you're stopping me because the color of my skin. When the officer stops and explains to you why the stop was made and what's the outcome of that stop, those body cams have been very significant. We recently had an issue in Beloit where about a month ago, a minority member of our community had been involved in an accident. The officer went there, did the investigation. It was any accident like any other accident. This individual decided that they would go on social media and lambaste the police for their biased approach to the investigation, that they never came and talked to them because they were minorities, didn't care about their kids, and that they made a decision on the accident based on bias or race. Well, we saw that on social media, which you can imagine went viral pretty quick, especially on the coattails of George Floyd and everything that's happening. So on our own, after being made aware of this, we pulled the body-worn camera to see what happened. And actually, it turned out that nothing could be further from the truth. We viewed the video. The officer did a tremendous job treating both parties equally, explaining to them and ensuring their safety, and even didn't make a decision. He goes, I'm looking at this. I can't tell who's really at fault, even though both parties wanted the other one to get a ticket. And this particular individual didn't have insurance. The officer could have wrote her a ticket for not having insurance. Instead, he chose not to. And she was there with her 2 young kids. So we contacted her and we said, hey, we see your viral post. This is very damaging to our reputation in the community, and it's not correct. Would you consider taking it down or come and meet with us? We'll go over the camera with you and address your concerns. She chose not to. So we put that video out on our own Facebook page really in support of our officers, which I think is equally important. And you have to be very careful with how we do that, but I think it was important. We had a member of our community that was not being honest and truthful about their interactions with our department, and that has very long-standing adverse effects. So my responsibility is to fix that. We tried to fix it informally, and that individual made a decision, so we put it out, and our video went viral pretty quick as well. And I think that was a very strong message and a lot of good response from our community at all levels about the good job that we were doing and how we did handle the situation. And the other part to that is that officer had no idea that this accident was going to result in such an enhanced look at, he had no idea. He handled it like I would believe he handled any other call. I think that says a lot about the culture of the organization because we were able to put that under the microscope. And now, obviously, if it had been inappropriate, we would have investigated and gone from there and contacted that woman and taken appropriate action, but it was not. And I have a lot of examples just from the use of body cams, how either misunderstanding or misperception has been changed as compared to situations where we would have investigated hours and days and weeks and never been able to come to a conclusion. And I think that's in large part why the personnel complaints dropped so much in our city since we implemented the body-worn cameras. The other thing that increased was our ability to sustain violations because of that information. So there's a huge benefit to the community, there's a huge benefit to the department in that technology and in addressing racial disparities. Real bona fide disparities, which I agree exist, and some that are just either miscommunicated or misperceived and need to also be addressed so that we don't proliferate bad will and bad feelings between law enforcement and our communities.
On that part of the question, you did touch on lack of trust when it comes to race. What do you have in place in fixing that?
Well, we have in Beloit, and we will do the same thing here, is increased our proactive engagement with the community. Been hugely successful. We had a partnership with Culver's Cone with a Cop, where we would just get together with the kids and the community members, but increasing the community meetings, the conversations with the community. But the big piece is the ability for our beat officers to have time to proactively, in a non-enforcement setting, engage our community. And from a peripheral view, it appears that we may not be positioned for that. While we have, I think, an outstanding community engagement team, I got to meet a lot of those folks and our SROs. I think the work that they do is extremely important. But as I think I commented last time when we were together, it's equally important, if not more so, from our community perspective, that they get to know their beat officers. And to do that, we have to create scheduling and staffing that provides beat officers those opportunities. We have an excellent bicycle unit here. We created a bicycle unit in Beloit just for that purpose. But if we don't ever get them out there on the bikes, or we don't ever create time, we have officers that will go out of service, attending a community meeting or an ad hoc in the park event. And that's okay. Dispatch will take them out of service because that's the kind of things that we also need them to do. It's not just crime fighting and traffic enforcement. It's that proactive non-enforcement engagement. But the officers have to have that opportunity. And I think in some areas and on some shifts, we're pretty much going from call to call and not at the beat officer level having that opportunity. So I think it's great what community engagement's doing. We need to enhance that at all levels. And that's how you start to build trust.
Okay. What was one of the most difficult decisions you've had to make as a leader in the law enforcement? And please describe the circumstances and the outcomes.
I think one of the most difficult decisions, a lot of people would say, well, just firing someone and things of that nature, but quite frankly, that's always been an easy decision, because if someone has risen to the level of termination, I don't feel bad about it, because they have tarnished, denigrated our profession, and done harm to our community. So I think internally, some of the toughest stuff is to remove people out of a coveted position or position for which they think they have extreme ownership. And I guess I would go back to when I was a captain in Milwaukee and overseeing the homicide division. We had a pretty elite group, and we developed our personnel to be very good, and we had a really good clearance rate. But we had one member who was also on our bomb squad that started to diminish in performance, and it was noticeable. Now, that could have been easily overlooked. I was also the commander of the bomb squad, so I had oversight and connectivity with this individual at various levels. And you can imagine how bomb squad operations is also very difficult. And so instead of overlooking that, first I had our lieutenants start to sit down and document and let this employee know that we were seeing some pretty bad performance deficiencies in a number of areas, and give him an opportunity to turn that around, change his behavior. Which unfortunately he didn't, and ultimately I had to have him in the office and have this one-on-one critical conversation about his future, not only with the homicide division, but with our department. And in doing so, it became emotional on his part, because I was able to figure out that actually there was some personal issues that were affecting his work performance. And as we talked through it, with the huge commitment and expectations of working in a division like that, came to a consensus on, and I didn't have to remove him, although that's what was going to happen. He agreed that, I should maybe step down from homicide, and I'll go back into general investigations until I can get my personal issues in order. And as I tell everyone, just because you're being removed today doesn't mean you can't come back tomorrow. If you turn it around and you show commitment and dedication and that you're willing to come and do this job, you're welcome back on the team. But we can't have that on this team. And that individual, surprisingly, did end up turning himself around, and towards the end of my tenure in Milwaukee, was actually placed back on the homicide division and performed well. He got his personal affairs in order. And sometime after that, actually reached out to me. He's now retired from Milwaukee PD, and reached out to me as a personal reference for one of the jobs he was applying for, and brought that up, and brought up that he really respected the action that I took, even though it was extremely difficult. And then if I had not done that, he would have continued to spiral downward, and who knows where he would be today. So that was pretty rewarding to hear that from another individual, another law enforcement professional, that, again, as we discussed earlier, if you ignore those difficult conversations, things are going to go south quicker, and you're not helping people.
Okay, we have just under 10 minutes left in your time slot and about 3 questions. So we'll keep moving along to the next question. Tell us how you have developed work relationships through trust and respect. Please describe a specific example of your ability to maintain positive relationships with the staff you supervise.
Well, relationships, again, are built on value and respect. So that starts out early in the tenure. And I establish those relationships with all my staff. Granted, there are folks who don't want to have that kind of a relationship, and that's cause for other action. But I think giving everyone the opportunity to come on board, so to speak, and be participative and meet expectations is important. As the chief, obviously, you can imagine that it's important to have relationships not just internally with the department, but with other city leaders, other elected officials. And I have been successful in doing that in a number of situations, as well as with elected officials. And during my time with the state Wisconsin Department of Justice, we worked with elected officials to create legislation that enhanced training and standards for law enforcement across the state. Those were difficult bills and difficult discussions. And we also worked with them in terms of developing an officer-involved death bill that the legislature passed that had received strong reticence and pushback from the law enforcement community. And so that was also a difficult time. But again, taking an approach of goodwill and mutual respect, working through our differences and finding consensus versus conflict is how I deal with all of those issues. And I think that's the expectation, obviously, of my staff. And that's just kind of been the approach I take in those situations.
What responsibility have you had leading a strategic budgeting process for a police department? And how would you develop and present your budget request?
Budgeting is a very important aspect of what we do, not only because we need to be fiscally prudent for our community, but we need to make sure that we are purchasing that which we need and not what we don't need. And so it's a prioritization, obviously, and I set up a system in Beloit. I did this in Milwaukee and at the state as well, where I work with my command staff division commanders, and they get whatever their budget deviation is. And the first go around, I lead them through this in more detail so they understand, because I've found at least a lot of our division level personnel have no budgeting experience. They were never shown the budget. They didn't even know what it was. Beloit, I had people go, "What? I didn't even know we had a training line." And so they had no concept. One person was keeping watch over that and not doing a very good job. So we break that down, again, dispersed leadership. Here's patrol's budget, here's investigations budget, here's administrative budget. Here are the goals of the organization, again, referencing our strategic plan, or are there items of immediate concern like body cams that we need to address? So let's look at what you did last year, what you spent and what you didn't spend, and what's necessary and what's not. And also, what technologies could we utilize or other efficiencies to replace things? We're currently in a budget process right now and looking at a number of different technologies to help offset other costs. And so at the division level, I let them work through that, figure out where those monies are going to fit, and then we come together and go over it. And again, by priorities and what's available, decide what budget will be presented to our elected officials. From that process, I meet with the city manager currently. At the state, we met with the attorney general to go over budget requests. And they also may have goals and objectives that they may feel are more of a priority. But I think the key is that when I present a budget, it will be well vetted. I will not have fat. In fact, in Beloit, I've cut $468,000 in overtime in 1 year as a result of the implementation of our 4 10-hour shift schedule, while also creating a common training day. So our whole department can train every week with no overtime cost. That is incredibly important in today's law enforcement environment, and a lot of agencies can't do that. They are training on overtime or changing off days, and it's very hit or miss, and it takes an awful long time for an agency to address something that happened today in any expeditious manner, and I think we have to be nimble enough to do so. So I take a very hard look at our operations and in terms of its budget and what I present. And when I ask for something from our city commission or mayor, it will be well researched, it will be well vetted, it will be resourced. I will provide my professional opinion. I'm not going to come in and say, hey, the world's going to fall apart or cops are going to die if we don't do this. I will give you a professional perspective based on data and information about why we should do A, B, or C, just as we discussed with the body-worn camera system. So you will have sufficient information, our elected officials will have sufficient information to make their decisions. And while I understand they may not always do what I suggest, they'll make their decisions in a well-informed posture. And we'll go back and try it again next time. So I completely understand that. But I think it's important for me to come forward with sufficient information to inform them and allow them to make those decisions.
All right, our final question for you this morning. To what extent have you been involved in establishing, communicating, and following up on performance expectations? How do you align performance expectations with organizational goals? And please be specific in your examples.
Sure. Well, again, performance evaluations, just like awards and letters of recognition and everything that we do, is wrapped around vision, mission, and values of the department and that initial branding. That's why that is so important. So when we look at performance evaluations, the personnel that I directly supervise and do performance evaluations for, I keep a file throughout the whole year. And again, I pass this along to our command staff as what I would say is a recommended model, because you're not going to remember at the end of the year, I assume you do annual evaluations, all the good things. You probably remember some of the bad things, but you're not going to have a very full context of what someone did over the course of a year if you're not tracking it. So I track that regularly for all of my direct reports that I have to do evaluations on, good, bad, and different, training that they've attended. And as I put it into the city's format for performance evaluations, I meld in how they have obtained, we list what the department goals were for the period and what they obtained and what they didn't obtain, and maybe something's pending, that kind of thing. But I meld in the values of the department as well. They did a great job turning around their ability to communicate internally and recognizing that as a value of accountability and integrity in the organization. Similarly, I will give them very frank evaluations, and I think everyone always has room for improvement, including myself. But it's how it's delivered, and it's based on information. So if I think someone's doing a really, really terrible job in a particular area, I will have information and examples to show them. Here was an email communication where you were really unprofessional and inappropriate with another department member, or city head, etc. That can't happen again, and so we document that, and what was, after we met about it, what was the outcome. So the evaluation accounts for the full spectrum of their work product over the course of the year. Obviously, we try and be encouraging because we want them to continue to be motivated and perform at a high level. And then there's some folks that maybe based on ability or motivation for whatever reasons are falling below performance concerns. That has to be addressed as well, and I've placed people on performance improvement plans. In one instance, actually a command level individual, and it was successful. They turned it around and they made the necessary improvements. And in other instances, supervisors who did not and ended up getting demoted and ultimately removed from the department. So you have to be prepared to take action on those evals and follow through if you're going to document poor performance, and also recognize good performance.
Thank you. Are there any follow-up questions?
I have one.
Okay.
Can I ask a question, please? I have a couple. One is about accreditation. What's your opinions on that? And then my second question is, obviously Wisconsin is a union state and North Dakota is a right-to-work state. And just if you could just talk about the contrast between those two.
Yep. Great questions. So accreditation, here's my experience with that. Now, when I started in Beloit, and if you Google the Hillard Heinz report, and again, they were not the fault of the officers or personnel for the most part, dysfunctional both operationally and culturally. And we had a big corner to turn, but those folks, it wasn't their fault, they had failed leadership. But that department was also accredited twice. They were accredited by CALIA. I know Mr. Kelly spoke about CALIA, and they were accredited by the Wisconsin Accreditation Committee, I forget the acronym, as well. So I'm walking into a department in which we don't even have supervisors on the street. We don't have people in roles and responsibilities. We're not addressing crime, but yet they're somehow double accredited. So I started delving into what does accreditation mean? And it turned out that what it meant, at least for them, was that once a year, they had to put together certain proofs so when the assessor came in, they could show them that we did all these things. Give us our accreditation and we're good. In fact, the chief that was escorted out said, how could he be removed? We're an accredited agency. We're doing everything right. But it was a fallacy, all right? It wasn't happening. So to them, accreditation wasn't part of their day-to-day operations. It was something they could wear on their cars and uniforms to provide the false belief that they were tip of the spear operation when they were everything but that at that time. So I called CALIA and I talked to them, and of course we ended up dropping out of both of those, but I talked to them and I said, how do you do your assessments? Well, we go there and we have a person that we know that we work with. And I go, well, let me ask you this. If you find that, and they would pull people off the street to do these proofs, pull in reports to meet specific metrics. And again, rules versus values, I mean, you're trying to follow a rule, but not a value of the organization, right? And they would spend all this time doing that. I go, what happens if they don't have all the proofs? Well, we give them a little time to, find it. Oh, so there's really no discreditation to any of this. It is keep us accredited, pay you money, and I'm not throwing rocks at accreditation because it can be a very good thing if done properly and if it's part of the organizational everyday operation. But in this case, it wasn't. And CALIA actually has changed some of their procedures since then, because one of the things I discovered was that our evidence unit had not been audited in probably 30 years, and there was so much wrong there that it would be a whole other conversation. But CALIA goes, oh, well, that's something that we don't look at. Okay, well, boy, that's a pretty important liability issue for any department. So that was CALIA, and then when I talked to our state organization, I'm like, hey, how did you guys accredit our department? Well, you guys are CALIA accredited, so we don't do the full Monty. We basically look at a couple things and assume that CALIA did most of it, and then we give you our stamp of approval, and please pay us our annual fee. So that's my thoughts on accreditation. You have Lexipol policies in place. I went to Lexipol and Beloit just for that reason. They're legally vetted. They're customizable for what the department's needs are. And I'm very happy with that operation. That would be a seamless transition for me, other than, I think, making some adjustments to policies, as we discussed, in terms of personnel complaints and some other things. But I don't think accreditation is necessary unless the governing body wants accreditation and they would like to pay for accreditation, then, that's fine. But I don't think it's necessary. Unions, I think there's a benefit to unions and there's a negative, obviously. Working in a union environment is different. So a lot of the changes that I implemented required consensus from the union, the troops, which I think is a good model anyway, but sometimes there's a lot of common sense things that need to get done, like mental health checks for all officers, but they end up in a conflict with the union because they want to, even though this is helping them, they still feel like they should get something for their mental health checks, which is counterintuitive to me, but it's a union environment philosophy, so that's where it's a negative. Here in North Dakota, I think there's a benefit, just as I did in Beloit, with setting up monthly meetings with shift or division representatives, line staff personnel who are interested in representing the broader group, and having those monthly or bi-monthly meetings or whatever they want to do to make sure that we have that connectivity and that I know about all the issues that are festering in the organization that might otherwise blow up on us. Other than that, I don't see any issue with changing from a union to a non-union. Probably for me as a chief, it's easier, but it's not easier because I still know intuitively that I need to have consensus from the troops in making changes, and they have to have buy-in, so that's still important.
Sorry, were there additional follow-up questions? Yes, Mayor.
You're coming from a smaller police force. Do you see a challenge in coming into the size of the city of Fargo and the size of the police force? When I look at your first 90-day challenges that you have there, it's a larger community than you're used to, and just curious how you feel you'll fit in, because you're smaller. It seems like in a smaller force it's easy to do some of the challenges you have, But one of the things that happens as the police force has gotten larger and as the officers talk, there's turnover and there's new people in the organization. So how do you view that challenge?
Actually, not in terms of challenge. I don't see it as a challenge at all. It's a great opportunity. My experience in Milwaukee, that was a 2,000 personnel force. And as a captain, I oversaw a police district with over 100,000 people, 200 some personnel. So in effect, I have already led organizations larger than the city of Fargo in these different positions. And albeit Beloit, as the chief, is smaller, the approach, the leadership philosophies, the things that are necessary are still the same. I would agree that it's going to take me a little longer to do some of the things in my initial transition than it may have in Beloit. But I'm a fairly ambitious, optimistic person, and I'm going to push forward. And this will be a little different, more so because of the distance in relocation for me. In the other places I transitioned, it was drivable, and I could, go home every day and stay late, and it wasn't an issue. So the big thing is relocating, but I think following my plan, I'm still going to accomplish a lot of what I set out to do in that first 90 to 120 days. It's going to take me through the rest of the year at least, if not into early 21, to have all those one-on-ones with all the cops. I completely agree with that, but I still think it's valuable and necessary, and I'll get it done. So I'm extremely excited about the opportunity to be the chief here, and I don't have any qualms or inhibitions about the size of the city or the size of the department or any of the issues that need to be addressed.
All right, thank you, and we will send
Thank you.
you back up to the HR office. Just a couple of quick notes for the committee. We'll take a break and allow you to complete your scoring and reconvene at 10:50 for the next presentation. Just a reminder, as you're completing your score sheets, if you do make any changes, please initial by the changes that you are making on those score sheets. Thank you. Okay, Stacy, we are ready for you to begin your 15-minute presentation.
All right. So I think we're still good morning. Haven't made the afternoon yet. So good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to start out by thanking you for inviting me to this part of the process. I'm very honored to be here. I know this is a very important decision for the city, and it's not to be taken lightly. So thank you for inviting me into the top three. As you know, we were tasked with completing a 90-day plan that would include the police department, the community, and the city of Fargo, and present it to you here. And so my 90-day plan, to take any organization to excellence, you need people, tools, and a plan. From all the research and the packed day that I had yesterday, I can see the people are in place. We have excellent people here. Not only in the department, but the city, the citizens. It's been such a warm welcome. Been able to pick up on that real quick. Tools, don't tell the police department that I'm saying this, but they don't have any complaints for equipment. You know, there are some wants, but there are no needs. They're very well equipped. They're, you know, everyone is pleased with the equipment they have, everything that I saw. You know, it's a very equipped agency. So that leaves the plan, and that's what I would be challenged with doing. In order to come up with the plan, I would conduct a SWOT analysis. That is a strengths, weakness, opportunity, and threat assessment of the agency from top to bottom. While I'm doing this, I would focus on efficiency, effectiveness, and community relations. And I would also look at policy and practices. Take a deep dive into the policies and why I am meeting with these different groups, any of the policies and practices that impact those groups. Have a discussion, see if there's anything we need to take into consideration, look at doing differently. For example, while we're talking about policy, body cameras. I know by watching the commission meetings that body cameras are coming. It's not a choice, and that's going to be a priority for the police department. But it's not as simple as just buying body cameras, pulling a policy off of Lexipol and putting them out on the street. There's a lot that goes into body cameras. First of all, just the trial. I initiated the whole process with Newport News Police Department. I ran that trial. I know the interim chiefs talked about Panasonic, which is a very good camera, but we should let the officers try everything that's out there. Panasonic, Motorola, and of course Axon are kind of the three top products in the market. We should select some officers, let them try all three. This is going to be what they're wearing every day. We should get their input on what the trial. Purchase. We have some power here. We're the largest municipal agency in the state. We're also part of a very large metropolitan area. There will be plenty of lucrative incentives to win our contract because we are a leader, so we should leverage that to our advantage, not only from the competitors, but also from Panasonic to keep us, because there's nothing worse than losing to one of the competitors. So there's all little ideas, and also when we purchase. If right now the timing's looking like we'd be ready by the end of the year, and that's ideal because end of the year deals are made to close them out by the end of the year. So there's a lot of things at our advantage being in the system. I know that front and back and could leverage that. We need to seal up the policy. The biggest one is when to release videos. You do not want to wait till you're in crisis to develop a policy. That's not going to be a good policy. It needs to be in place beforehand. There's a lot of stakeholders involved, and this is the top decision of when do you release a video after a critical incident. The community is going to want to see it right away. The prosecutor may not want it released right away. It could damage their case. So we need to have those discussions now, and it needs to be in writing beforehand. And of course, some we may be able to release sooner, others we may have to hold on according to the circumstances, but we at least need some guidance before we get into it. And then the community engagement and education, we need to let the community know what to expect, what we've decided on. If we prepare them to say, hey, whenever possible, we will release it within 24 hours, but there are certain instances, or maybe the prosecutor's put his foot down and says, on these cases, we will not release videos. You know, we have to take that into account and educate the community so they know what to expect. Our community partners, we don't want the school principal to see a body camera for the first time on the first day of school when the SROs show up. We need to have these meetings beforehand, come to a consensus on when we will record, when we won't record, make sure they understand how they work. Same thing with the hospitals. We made the mistake, didn't meet with the hospitals. The head of the hospital called the chief's office. What are you doing with cameras in here? Are you crazy? There's all this. So we made the mistake, won't make it again. Meet with the hospital, let them know, hey, we will only record when we're there on official business. When you see us walking down the hall, it's not recording. Again, make sure they know how they work, know what to expect, and come to an agreement on what works for them and works for us, meet in the middle. And then lastly, our judicial partners. This is going to create a big workload for the prosecutors because right now we have a single car camera, the video they have to review. Now if you have a scene with 5, 6, 7 officers, that's 7 videos that they have to review. They're responsible for every single minute of that video prior to court. They're going to have to increase their workload. So it's not just the city of Fargo, it affects all of our partners, and this is stuff they need to be ready for and prepared. So then getting into the police department, first I would meet with the internal candidates that applied for this position. Believe it or not, some officers are sensitive. You know, we have feelings too. I want to make sure that they're in a good spot. I want to talk to human resources, see what I can share with them, meet with them, see what their career goals, ambitions are, and make sure that I'm able to help them fulfill that. And like I said, just make sure they're in a good position to continue on. I want to meet with every employee, not only just to get to know them, but to make sure they understand my vision right from the horse's mouth. It's not filtered. Make sure they know that. And I'm going to challenge them. These are unique times we're in. This is kind of a reformation of law enforcement. I want to challenge them to look at their job and to see if we can do things differently, if we can provide better services, if we can be more efficient, and empower them to drive those decisions right up to the chief's office. I don't care if you're the newest officer or the deputy chief. I want you to be empowered to own that decision and run with it. You know, we'll have to go through the right change. You can't just make a decision on your own, but I want you to own it and run with it. I'm going to do a policy review. I talked earlier about the discipline policy, which I think needs to be tweaked, created. And then also I want a duty to intervene policy. And this would be a policy that would empower, it would actually mandate anyone from the lowest officer all the way through the chain of command, if they see something that is not right on the street, to intervene. If the chief loses his temper and is doing something he's not supposed to do, that officer that's in field training is required by policy to intervene and stop me and say, hey, chief, come over here, you know, relax, get your cool. That should be a policy that supports the officers and the city. I also want to do a deep dive with supervisors, training staff, and PTOs. My experience, culture is what really drives an agency, not policy. These 3 groups have the biggest impact on our officers. They're with them daily, they're training them, they're supervising them, so I want to make sure they understand the message and they're on the right page and they're delivering that message to the officers appropriately. Then the community. Meet with all the established community groups and programs. I know we have active community officers right now and there's plenty of programs in place. So I want to meet with them, make sure, you know, they know who I am, know where I'm coming from. And I also want to ensure that underrepresented segments have a voice. Anything from Islamic Society, Native American, NAACP, One Fargo, anybody that wants to start dialogue with the chief of police is welcome. We're open to do it. That can lead into monthly meetings, quarterly meetings. However, what works best for us, what we need, I will be there, I'll be available. Also bring in command staff to those meetings so it's just not the chief. Something that I'm very passionate about, in Newport News we had a pastor liaison group. I'd like to see if that would work here. We met with pastors, all of our pastors, once a month that wanted to participate, and anything was available for discussion. What we found out was mom, grandma would hear stories that Junior was out doing, and you know, you don't quite get the full story when you're grandma. You go to church, you're venting about it. We wanted the pastors to be equipped to know the full story that they could nip it in the bud. We would share extra information with them and the media on the media open house that I'm going to talk to next. We kind of treated them the same. They met differently, but we had officer-involved shooting, 2 white officers, a black male. We brought each group in and we shared crime scene photos with them. Wouldn't let them, the media, film it, but we shared it with the past them just to show, here is what happened. Here's the proof that we have so far. Here's what's going to come out, just so that they're equipped to speak about things a little better. So in return, the pastors, they would host breakfast, lunch. We would have our officers show up there. Not only would they invite their members, but they would invite the neighborhood. So this would give us a chance for the officers to interact with citizens in a non-confrontational manner, build those relationships early so that it pays off later if need be. So same thing with the media open house. Not only would we share a little bit more information with them, but it would be with the command staff and the media. We would meet once a month. It was open to all of them. And again, any question was on the table and we would answer it to the best of our ability. If we couldn't talk about it at the time, we would tell them, hey, this investigation is still ongoing. I can't talk to you. We had one where the Commonwealth attorney did not want to release the video, but he was fine with them watching the video. So we told them, turn off all their cameras. Here's the video you can watch, you can report, but the Commonwealth attorney just did not want to release it at the time. So that worked out really well. Also, walk and talks. This is where I would go out into the precinct. I would take the precinct officers. If we had a recruit class going on, the trainees would come out as well, go out and just walk around a beat. Again, this is non-confrontational, getting the officers out of the car, getting them comfortable talking to people, just getting to know, find out what the problems are, what's going on in that neighborhood. And also virtual chat with the chief. This little thing called COVID come around. Plus, there's people that are just too busy to come out and meet at certain times. Using Facebook Live or other social media, I would host virtual chats at various times in the evening, early morning, so that people that couldn't come out to a designated meeting can come on and they can ask questions or just watch and hear what's going on from the police department. So, these are all just some ideas to engage with the community to get feedback. So last but not least, mayor, city commissioners, and administration. This would actually been the first group that I met with before starting all this to make sure that I'm on the same page. I'm pretty confident with the research that I've done and all the interviews that I have a good idea of where we're heading, but still want to get it, make sure that we're on the same page and that I'm going out and fulfilling their mission, supporting the city. Don't want to go down a different road. Human resources, meet with them, make sure that we are screening our applicants for things such as empathy, emotional intelligence, that we're hiring the right applicants to come into the police department. And last, department heads. This is where, coming from the outside, I can leave the ego at the door. Everything's on the table and look at, is there things that can be handled more efficiently somewhere else, more effectively by somebody? Maybe there's things that we give up to other departments. Maybe there's some things that we need to take on. But this would be some good open conversations with the department heads to see where we can work as a team to see what best fits where and who can do it the best. So as I said, people, tools, and the plan. I would report back on the SWOT analysis, the strategic management plan. That I would be working on that kind of along the way. We touched on that earlier. That was part of the questions. But I want to reinforce this would be a steering committee of officers, supervisors, and even civilians that would help create this plan with my guidance, that would help fill in. And all of this stuff would focus on efficiency, effectiveness, and community relations. That would kind of be the core of everything that we do. So thank you for the time, and now I guess I transition up here.
Stacy, thank you for that presentation. We're ready to begin your interview. Jen and I will be rotating asking the questions for your interview today. We will pause between questions to see if there are any follow-up questions from the committee. A few of the questions are a little bit longer, so please let us know if you need us to repeat any of the questions for you.
Okay.
All right. So we'd like to start off by having you tell us about your leadership style and how it has changed and developed as you've gained more experience as a leader in law enforcement.
So my style is really supporting the officers and providing them with what they need. Clear communication, need to set the goals out front, the objectives, make sure that they are communicated efficiently and clearly so that everybody's on board. And just being out, you cannot manage from behind the desk. You have to be out to make sure that these things are being implemented, check on and make sure that the rubber's actually meeting the road. And I would say as I progressed, you know, I went from a doer to it's really hard for me to stand back and keep my hands out of things. When started the police academy, things like that, those were projects that I owned, and the body camera. So I was used to just doing the work and getting it done and going at a fast pace and moving on. So it's really difficult as you move up to stand back and let those other supervisors shine and do their thing. So I know that this is a weakness of mine, so I constantly keep myself in check and make sure that I'm managing and supporting them and not getting too involved, but letting them know that I'm always there. And one of the ways that I work around this is just asking a lot of questions. So I ask questions instead of giving guidance, and that way make sure the thought process is in and that they understand where we're going.
All right. Many police departments operate under a paramilitary command structure. Is this the right structure for the police departments in 2020 and into the future? How do you think the internal command structure affects the overall culture and morale of the police departments? And if you think there is a better approach to leadership within police departments, please describe.
Yeah, I think we've been moving away from paramilitary. I know our academy, we completely, I don't want to say completely got, but we took more of a collegiate approach to the academy itself, which that's kind of the last stronghold for the paramilitary. You know, we're bringing very smart, bright young men and women into the department now that are college educated. They don't need to be brought in and screamed at and treated like kids when they're in there. Yes, we need to instill discipline. There are times where an officer needs to do what he's told, but those are rare. For the most part, we're taking a 20-something-year-old and putting them out on the street with a gun and a badge and expecting them to make decisions on their own. So we need to treat them like adults from the beginning and give them those tools. There are times where we still need the structure, you know, the riots, civil unrest that's going on now, those are times where you definitely need that structure in place and you need to be able to command and control. But 90% of what we're doing are officers out on their own making these decisions. This is actually where the advantage of being in the private sector will pay off because taking that break and getting exposed to different types, the lowest person in Axon, they are empowered. If they come up with an idea, they run with it, and they're supported by the agency to go with it, and you break out of the norms. It's not the old way of, well, you report up the chain. If it gets up to the top, then we will figure out and we'll do a committee and we'll kill this in committee. No, whoever has this idea, they can run with it. We give them the resources, temporarily reassign them to do their thing. So I think that could really work in the police department. So we're looking at a hybrid of both, but really the paramilitary is going to be a very small portion of that hybrid relationship.
In light of recent events, what have you learned from incidents around the country related to protests and riots? As the Fargo Police Chief, how would you support the right to a peaceful protest while protecting a city from individuals who use the peaceful events as an opportunity to incite a riot? What steps would you take to try to prevent violence and rioting?
So lessons learned, I look back to Hampton Roads. Newport News it's just ingrained. We're known for community outreach and engagement. During this whole event, Newport News, Norfolk, Hampton had a little bit, but Newport News, Norfolk, the agencies that really practice community policing did not see the civil unrest. They had protests, they had issues, but they did not see it. So that just proves that laying the foundation early, making those relationships, just like I said, a time of crisis is not when you want to make policy. Well, a time of crisis is not when you want to work on community relations. That needs to be built every day, every hour that you're out by all the officers, all the command staff. So building these relationships early pays off in the long run. We had a lot of community leaders in Newport News that stepped up and helped keep the peace and reminded people, hey, you are here to protest, but let's not act like these other cities and embarrass ourselves. When it comes to the actual marches, different things, I would like to meet with the groups beforehand. We would reach out anytime we got word that anyone was going to do a protest of any sort. We would reach out, find out what their goal is, and support them. If it called for shutting down the street, originally we would only allow them to be on the sidewalk. And we got things like, well, why? What's the reason for that? Why was that decision made? Nobody come up with a big answer. So we as a police department would shut down the street so that they had room to do their thing, and we would protect them and allow them to protest. And we met with the organizers and we laid out these parameters, and we were also very clear. Here's your swim lane. If you get out of this swim lane, if you start causing destruction, then you will leave us no choice but to respond to your actions. We're here to support you. One guy would always push it. He would say, I'm going this route. We would have all of our officers planned out. Well, he would come to the intersection and he would take a right when he was supposed to take a left. So we would just shift our officers. We would go with the flow. We would bend over backwards to adjust to help. But they knew up front, it was clear where the boundaries were. We can't allow destruction of property. We can't allow looting. That's when we would interject. And even well before this, our philosophy on riot gear was our response officers were there, but they were never seen. Too many instances that can incite things and make it worse. All of our officers were trained. They were equipped. We had special gear that was kept off to the side. According to sometimes we didn't even have it out. It's according to who was there, what was going on, what intelligence we had. But they were always there and ready, but not out there standing the line, causing the issues. So those are just, a lot of these things come back to relationship building and communication with leadership.
I'd have a follow-up to that. I think that, and maybe this is just my thoughts, that some of the agitators, the looters, rioters, weren't part of that leadership group that you would have had that conversation with. They came from elsewhere, whether it was internal to the community or whether it was external to the community. They weren't involved in those conversations. How do we identify the good guys from the bad guys when it's not always like they're wearing the white hats and the black hats or something?
Yeah, this comes down to quality intelligence, having a really good intelligence unit in place. I was somewhere in Tennessee. I travel a lot with Axon, but I was in Tennessee when one of these incidents sparked. Matter of fact, as I pulled up to the hotel, they were like, "Give me your car. I'm getting in the basement. They're coming." So, but I went over and talked to the officers afterwards, and they had intelligence. They knew which group come in. They worked with the FBI, their partners at the FBI. They knew who was there to cause problems. They had them identified. They were watching. They even had that group under surveillance and saw them out taking GPS coordinates of potential targets, potential things. So yes, you've got to have the intelligence. You have to do your homework and know who's there and try to just deal with that and not treat the entire group for the misbehaving of the small one. Try to remove them from the herd, per se.
Okay. Morale is a common issue in law enforcement agencies. The Fargo Police Department has experienced issues with morale as well. What methods have you used in previous leadership positions to measure employee engagement, satisfaction, or morale? In general, what strategies do you believe are most effective to maintain employee engagement, overall satisfaction, and positive morale within a police department?
And so a couple of things on that. The one thing, and I told the officers this because this come up with, I am a big fan of surveys, but I'm not a fan of anonymous surveys. I have done those within the department, and they usually go south real quick. You get a lot of good information, but you get a lot of people taking vendettas, being nasty because they can, and it's not everybody, but it's a few. So survey is one thing, throw it out there, but make them known your name's going to be on the survey. You're going to own it. Another thing that was extremely successful in Newport News, we had line level and supervisor advisory boards with the chief. This was both for sworn and employee, and they met monthly with the chief, and anything was up for discussion that he could talk about, legally or within policy. And they would turn in an agenda beforehand to let him know what they wanted to talk about. And he would reach out to us, the assistant chiefs, and we would go over it and be like, okay, we need to have this person here. Maybe we'll have the IA sergeant come in to talk about this because they're wanting to do this. So having that open communication, and the members of those boards were, from different parts of the agency, and they were chosen by their peers to represent them, and they would go back. They would bring the issues, and then they would take it back. And then we would also publish the minutes of those meetings. So keeping everybody as up to date as possible. We also published the minutes of the command staff meeting. My liaison officers were like, man, this is eye-opening. I never really go what's going on in that wing. Well, we would publish all the minutes of the staff meeting and make it available for every officer so they knew that there wasn't any magic going on behind the closed doors. Also, I was the direct representative for the Police Foundation. The Police Foundation was a great tool. It was some business members, retired mayor that come together that wanted to start a police foundation to support. Ended up supporting all the police departments there in the region, but it was the Newport News Police Foundation. And this was provided money for things that you couldn't budget. They rented out a museum, and we just had a day for the police department, for them and their families to come, and it was the Mariners Museum. They could just come, they could relax. It was just law enforcement. We provided food. The executive staff manned the grills. We brought in different things for the kids. Just a day for them to relax and let them know that they are appreciated, because these are stressful times, and the officers, it takes a toll on them and their families. So for the foundation supporting them, and the foundation also supported the community. They bought us trailers with toys that we could take out and interact with children. So they served multiple hats, but their main mission was to support the welfare of the agency.
As the chief of police, you lead a command staff who are responsible for the oversight of divisions of the department. How do you engage your command staff to lead in a way that supports your overall strategy while engaging, inspiring, and informing the officers who work in their divisions?
A similar question come up from the command staff, and I said, my philosophy, when an issue is identified through the department that we need to fix, or through the community, something we need to address that is a known issue, we'll get together as a command staff. I expect them to do their homework on it, talk to their officers, bring as much information as we can, and we can argue all day long right now. They can tell me it's a very bad idea, that's my idea is horrible, it's not going to work, but once we come to a consensus, maybe we don't come to a consensus, but once a decision is made, I expect the command staff to support that decision, to go out and follow through with that. So we can argue behind doors, but once a decision is made, I hear you, I hear your complaints, I acknowledge them, but here's why we're going to move forward. And I would want them to go to their subordinates and give them the why of what we're doing. This is even just this generation. Humans in general want to know why. To just throw out a new directive with no story to it, that's when they usually don't get followed. So if, as the command staff, they're explaining why it's going on, we did a shift change. Nothing will disrupt an officer quicker than you change his shift hours, but the manpower study we did showed it. So I actually, as the assistant chief, went out to those briefings. My captains would cover it, and I was there to take the abuse. When the officers would, if someone wasn't happy with it, I would stand up and I would take, here it is. So I would continue that philosophy as the chief. I would be there to support them as they're sending the message down and make sure everyone's on the same page.
How have you worked to educate yourself on the racial and socioeconomic inequalities at a local, state, and national level? And how do you think those factors will influence your leadership of our police force?
Basically, educated through living. Newport News was a very diverse city. So my entire career was spent in a diverse city and seeing the inequality in lower southeast Newport News, very high density housing, long history there. So we bent over backwards to do our part as an agency and as a city. The city was very supportive of that community and always trying to make sure it was a level playing field. The experience that I've received actually, traveling around the world with other law enforcement agencies, seeing how they handle things, the training that I've received at the FBI National Academy, those sort of things. You look at different ways to handle diversity and inclusion and inequality. So you just keep an eye out for it and do our part to make sure it's as level of a playing field as possible.
Describe your experience gathering and tracking police department data to maintain an equitable police department in regards to race, homelessness, income, and other demographic factors. How has this data been collected and analyzed in police departments you have led? And how have you utilized this data in your department's operations and strategic plans?
Do you mind repeating that one more time?
That is a long one. So we'd like to start by having you describe your experience gathering and tracking police department data to maintain an equitable police department in regards to race, homelessness, income, and other demographic factors. How has this data been collected and analyzed in police departments you have led? And how have you utilized this data in your department's operations and strategic plans?
So at Newport News, we were a CALEA certified agency, and we were responsible for tracking demographics, mostly with hiring and discipline. So we kept constant records and promotions, hiring, promotions, discipline on race and sex. So that's part of our normal operating procedure. We would track everything that's going, and we would monitor it to make sure that we tried to strive for percentages to make sure that we represented the community that we worked in. Very tough thing to do. Females are hard to attract to law enforcement, but we really bent over backwards and would do a lot of heavy recruiting there. And just to try to make it as CALEA going around to different agencies, digging into their data and watching it. Homelessness and income, that's one thing that I have not really seen tracked. I mean, most cities keep up with their homeless population, but it's really hard to keep good, accurate data. You can talk to any city and they will be like, yeah, we know we have a problem. And by the way, I was very impressed with the way the homeless situation is handled here on the tour that I got. It appears with the shelters and everything, it's mitigated nicely here. But you probably have better luck here with the shelters. You have them in one area and you can keep your demographics and gather the data on them. But most cities don't have anything like that in place, so they're dispersed, they're hard to track down. So I've not really seen many agencies that have good luck on tracking them. Big good resource is the city itself. We find out that the city tracks a lot of data. We can get income and economic data from the city and use that. And that should just be used anytime we're looking at enforcement, policy procedures. Take all that information into account whenever we're making decisions to make sure we're being fair and equitable in everything that we do.
To follow up, can you address the racial part of the data collection?
As far as internal, so every agency that I've dealt with, of course, there's all CALEA agencies, but it's captured on the application as you're applying. And then whenever we do promotions and discipline, it's also, we keep track of it in databases just to keep an eye out for anything that doesn't look right, anything that's out of alignment. And then as far as the arrest information, that's usually gathered through incident-based reporting, IBR system. That's stuff that we see all the time. And it usually criminal stuff, we're reactive. as far as arrest. You can use it for traffic stops, and that should be used to check on the officers to make sure that they are in line with everyone else. Look for those disproportionate in certain ways, so that can be tracked with traffic summonses. Anything pro-enforcement where the officers are going out enforcing arrests, that's where you would really see that pop up and send red flags.
What was one of the most difficult decisions you have had to make as a leader in the law enforcement? Please describe the circumstances and the outcomes.
Probably the most difficult to say. So the problem ended up mine to deal with, but it come over promotion when I got promoted to assistant chief. One of the candidates, he got passed over, and he was not happy about it. So he made the department's life a little rough. We tried, and up to this point, he had a stellar record, no issues. So we tried peer counseling. He had a good relationship with one of the other assistant chiefs. We tried hey, come on, this is negative behavior, this and that. That didn't work. So then I actually had to start down the route of, giving him expectations. He didn't meet them, and it ended up in a letter of counsel, which in the discipline world, that's counseling. It's not really on your record. It doesn't count against you, but to someone who had made it to captain without any issues in their life, that was a tough thing to do. He took it hard. It was hard for me to do. But looking back on it, there's nothing that could have been done different because it was his behavior. Maybe starting a little bit earlier on with the open dialogue about that and just bringing it to a head sooner. Because we all kind of knew it was there, but we kind of ignored it, hoping it would get better. So that would be a lesson learned, is to come on, take those issues on as soon as you see it, tackle it, and don't let it fester and get out of control, because that doesn't help either person. You can't just hope it goes away.
Follow-up question. You had that as part of your 90-day plan. You had internal candidates and discussion and dialogue with them identified. Did this situation populate that
Absolutely.
on your 90-day plan?
Yes. Yeah, and not even just him. I've seen other people, like I said, you throw your heart into a process and then don't get it. Some people, take it personally. And that's why the main goal of that is to check on them and make sure, well, let's see what your career path is and how we can help you. So, yeah.
Tell us how you have developed work relationships through trust and respect. Please describe a specific example of your ability to maintain positive relationships with the staff you supervise.
A lot of the trust and respect is just getting out and doing it. You have to walk the walk. You can't just talk it. So, we spend a lot of time on weekends out at community meetings, cookouts. I would go to those events, even as command staff, I would go in on the weekends, even though my schedule was Monday through Friday, because I expected my officers to be there. So I would go out, I'd be on the front lines with them doing these things. Keeping a positive role, probably when I worked communications, our communication center was in the basement of our city hall, a city hall that probably saw its prime in the 70s. And here they're in the basement, very poor ventilation, no lights. It was very hard for them. And previous supervision had just stayed at headquarters. Well, I made sure to spend time down there. I would spend briefings and work with them on improving what we could, working with what was given us. We got new carpet, we got new furniture, we allowed them to paint a mural on the wall to brighten things up. So it's very hard to keep a positive attitude when you're in a very bad work environment. So I made sure they know that I was going to experience with them. I was going to sit in my plush office while they went through this. So I spent as much time as I could down there and would even work out of that area as much as I could, just to, be with them and experience their pain.
What responsibility have you had with leading a strategic budgeting process for a police department? And how would you develop and present your budget request?
So a lot of my supervision from CAP, actually from lieutenant on up, was spent in administration. We had a single person, our fiscal manager, who was responsible for the overall budget. Of course, the chief is ultimately responsible, but she was the budget person. She handled all that. So with the academy, I ended up getting involved in that budget process, and it grew from just the training part because we actually could get funds from the city and the state because we were a training academy. So that took a lot of documentation and working on the budget, and plus growing a whole new academy. We had to put that in line items. So I ended up doing a lot of work providing information on doing the budget, and ended up staying with her through every year for the rest of my career. I would be heavily involved in preparing the budget with her, providing the feedback, justification for what we need. I would even go to the budget hearings and present parts of the budget, and then in turn would turn around and be responsible for monitoring, our end of the budget. So as a captain and as assistant chief, the budget was ours to control, and we were held accountable for it. So.
To what extent have you been involved in establishing, communicating, and following up on performance expectations? How did you align performance expectations with organizational goals? And please be specific in your examples.
Again, in ASME, when I was in admin, we redid our evaluation process. So what we came up with, overall, the evaluation, there were a few items that were non-negotiable. They were kind of set in stone that would support the vision of the city, and the police department. But then there were items in the evaluation which the officer and their direct report would put in at the beginning of the year. They would basically come up with measurable items that would be in there, whether it was for most of the time, one of them had to do with their development, what their career goals were, how we could develop them, and then the things that were specific to their beat or their work area. So we completely crossed some waves with the city because we wanted to create our own to make it work for the police department instead of just a generic overall evaluation. So this worked out really good, and by getting the buy-in from the officer, making it clear at every year, hey, you actually helped develop some of the things you're going to be judged on. It makes them accountable for that throughout the whole year. So personalizing evaluations as much as you can actually pays off and allows them to, focus on their work area as well as their development.
Thank you. That was the last interview question that we have for you. Are there follow-up questions from the committee?
Can you talk a little bit about accreditation at your current place, and also what your opinions are of it?
Yes, so, I'm with Axon now, so we don't have, but at Newport News, we're one of the oldest accredited agencies. So the way accreditation works, there are set standards that were created. CALEA was actually started with Noble, IECP, and one other. Those organizations come together, and they set standards that they felt were very important to keep an agency out of trouble. Matter of fact, there has never been an agency put under a consent decree that had accreditation. So I personally would not want to work for an agency that wasn't accredited, and that would be one of the things that we would look at here. I'd bring that to the table, see if that works here. So the way it works, these standards are in place, you have to meet the standards, and you have to prove that you're doing them. So throughout the year, you have to prove that you're not doing racially motivated enforcement. So you have to go out, pull your stats, put them in a file. Now it's all electronic, but it used to be fill in manila envelopes. But put it in an electronic file to prove, that your enforcement is above board, that you're hiring, or you have to show all your percentages of race, sex, that you're hiring, promoting, all that. And then every 3 years, outside assessors, which have been trained, other law enforcement professionals will come in and go through your agency top to bottom. They're checking those files, they're checking your policies, but more importantly, they're interviewing officers, civilians to make sure you're doing what you said, what you put in those files. Being an assessor, and it works both ways, because being as an assessor, I did almost probably a lead assessor on probably almost a dozen agencies in Canada and across the country. You see what's working really well or what may not work, and you bring those ideas back, so it actually grows your agency. So not only are you held accountable, but if you're actually participating in it, you go out. The drawback is it's cumbersome. There's like 300, the minimum standards are like 368, so it takes a lot of work to stay on top of that. An agency this size, you would need one person pretty much doing that full time. But the payoff is you're opening yourselves up to outside. That really goes a long way with the trust with the community, because you're saying, hey, we're bringing these people in, they have access to everything. They go through your internal affairs files, through all your finances. Everything is open. You can't deny anything to them. So in the long run, it pays off. It's cumbersome, it's expensive, but it really holds you to national best practices.
Are there any other follow-up questions? Okay, thank you, Stacy. You can go back up to the Human Resources office, and they will show you where you'll be having lunch today. And for the committee, we are done a little bit early, but I believe our lunches either are or will be ready soon on a table out in the atrium behind the reception desk. We will have a slightly longer lunch than planned. If you can plan to be kind of back near your chairs by about 12:40, we'll begin the next presentation at 12:45.
meet any special requirements, you can come. And so community engagement for us is about getting out, spending time with kids outside of our four walls who may not have the means to get here.
We also have a Metro Arts Pass, and that is a pass that you can check out from the library. It's gonna give you opportunities to get tickets to various events or cultural programs in the community. There are also some free admittance to the Red River Zoo in there. There's just a wide variety of things that with that pass you can get access to. We have a library of things. So these are objects that people wouldn't expect to find at a library, and these items can be checked out. So we have mobile hotspots, so wireless access, people can check out those. We also have board games that people can check out. It's kind of a neat thing. Some of the board games these days are getting kind of expensive and you're not sure you want to invest in one, so it's a great way to try one out. We have adventure backpacks for kids. We also have North Dakota State Park passes that are available for people to check out, and that gets them free admittance to State Park here in North Dakota.
Our thing is to make kids avid readers, to want to read. Because we know from research that kids who are readers are more successful in school, that it makes life easier for everyone, parents and children alike, if they enjoy reading, if they're good at it, if they want to get better at it. My mom was a single mom. One of the things that I attribute to the fact that I'm the only college graduate in my family and I have a master's degree is that every night before I went to bed, she read to me.